I can't live like this anymore.
Then leave the papers. You never knew what I was building.
Johnny Simmons was 39, a senior structural engineer from Columbus, Ohio, and the kind of man who preferred blueprints over applause. After a bridge accident left him paralyzed, everyone believed his life had quietly ended. He still drank black coffee every morning, filled worn notebooks with engineering sketches, and never complained. What no one knew was that Johnny had spent years building something far greater than any bridge. The moment Peyton laid divorce papers across his hospital bed, his numb fingers trembled above the pen, and the future changed forever. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, leave a comment with your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love emotional stories filled with powerful twists, quiet resilience, and unforgettable endings, be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story may be the one that stays with you the longest. 8 months before Peyton placed those divorce papers on Johnny Simmons' hospital bed, life followed a rhythm that rarely surprised him. Every weekday began at 5:15 a.m. His coffee brewed while the local Columbus news played quietly in the kitchen. By 6 o'clock, he was already reviewing inspection reports inside a worn leather notebook that had traveled with him for nearly 15 years. Each page carried neat handwriting, tiny sketches of bridge joints, handwritten load calculations, and observations that most engineers would have typed into software. Johnny trusted paper more than computers when it came to first impressions. He drove the same dark blue Ford F-150 that had nearly 180,000 miles on its odometer. Ryan Cooper often joked that the truck deserved retirement more than Johnny did. Johnny only smiled. "The truck still starts," he always answered. On a cool October morning, the inspection team met beside the aging Franklin River Bridge outside Cincinnati, Ohio. The steel truss bridge had carried interstate traffic for nearly 50 years and was scheduled for a federally mandated structural evaluation under the National Bridge Inspection Standards. The sky was clear. A light breeze moved across the river. Traffic above continued uninterrupted while the inspection crew prepared beneath the bridge. Ryan Cooper, 28, energetic and ambitious, adjusted his climbing harness. "You know," Ryan laughed, tightening his helmet strap, "most engineers spend their days in air-conditioned offices." Johnny clipped his safety lanyard into place. "And most bridges don't care where the calculations were made." Lucas Miller, a veteran bridge inspector with 22 years of field experience, chuckled. "That's the most Johnny answer I've heard all month." Dana Brooks, the project coordinator, walked toward them carrying a digital tablet. "Weather's perfect," she said. "Department of Transportation wants today's preliminary report before 5. Johnny nodded. "We'll give them facts, nothing else." That sentence had become almost a trademark. Facts, nothing else. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no guesses. That philosophy had earned Johnny enormous respect throughout Ohio's engineering community. He had postponed projects costing millions of dollars because a single bolt appeared unusual. He had once shut down an entire overpass for 36 hours after detecting microscopic fatigue cracks invisible to almost everyone else. People complained. Traffic backed up for miles. 3 months later, investigators discovered internal steel corrosion exactly where Johnny predicted. Since then, even contractors who disliked delays trusted his judgment. By 8:10 a.m., the inspection platform had descended beneath the eastern span. Steel surrounded them. Old rivets reflected scattered sunlight. The smell of rust mixed with river water. Johnny ran his gloved fingers slowly along one vertical support beam. He stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Ryan." Ryan looked over. "What do you see?" Ryan leaned closer. "Surface corrosion." Johnny remained silent. Lucas joined them. "I'd call that normal aging." Johnny reached into his tool bag and removed a portable ultrasonic thickness gauge. He pressed it against the steel. The reading appeared. His expression never changed. Again, another measurement, then another. Ryan watched quietly. "What's wrong?" Johnny spoke softly. "These numbers don't match the maintenance records." Dana looked up from below. "Problem." Johnny ignored the question for several seconds. He studied another beam, then another connection plate. Finally, he looked toward Lucas. "When was the last deep ultrasonic inspection?" Lucas checked his records. 6 years ago. Johnny slowly shook his head. "It should have been 2. Ryan frowned. "Think it's serious?" "I don't know." The answer frustrated younger engineers. Johnny refused to speculate before evidence existed. He climbed farther beneath the bridge. His flashlight moved slowly across the lower cord. A thin hairline fracture caught the edge of the light, barely visible, almost invisible. He crouched. The crack continued behind a reinforcing plate. Farther than expected. Johnny carefully scraped away accumulated paint with a small inspection blade. The fracture became longer, nearly 11 inches. His heartbeat slowed instead of accelerating. That always happened when danger appeared. His emotions became quieter, not louder. "Dana." She answered immediately. "Yeah. Call Ohio DOT." "For what?" "I want temporary traffic restrictions." Ryan looked confused. "Already." Johnny stood. I don't like what I'm seeing." Lucas walked over. "You think the bridge is unsafe?" "I think we don't have enough information." Ryan laughed nervously. "That's not exactly comforting." Johnny looked at the young engineer. "Comfort doesn't keep bridges standing." The radio crackled. Dana contacted state transportation officials. Johnny continued examining another support joint. Then everything happened in less than 4 seconds. A sharp, metallic pop echoed beneath the bridge. Nobody moved at first. Another louder crack followed. Johnny looked upward instantly. One suspension bracket had shifted. Not much, just enough. His voice exploded across the platform. "Everyone move!" Steele screamed. The inspection platform lurched violently. Ryan froze. His safety cable caught against a railing. Lucas turned too late. One connecting beam snapped with a deafening explosion. Johnny lunged toward Ryan with every ounce of strength he had. He shoved the younger engineer sideways. Ryan crashed against the platform floor as several 100 pounds of twisted steel slammed into the exact spot where he had been standing. The platform tilted. Equipment scattered. Dana screamed from the communication station. Lucas lost his footing. Johnny grabbed the older inspector's harness with one hand. The second impact came harder. Metal twisted. Bolts fired through the air like bullets. Another support cable failed. The entire inspection platform broke away from one side of the bridge. Gravity took over. Everything fell. The sound became strangely distant inside Johnny's mind. He remembered only fragments. Cold air. Flying tools. Ryan shouting his name. Steel grinding against steel. The river rushing upward. Then darkness. Johnny regained consciousness only for seconds. Bright white lights moved above him. Someone was cutting away his jacket. Another voice counted backward. "Blood pressure dropping. We're losing him. Prepare life flight." His body refused to respond. He tried moving his legs. Nothing. Not pain. Nothing. He attempted again. Still nothing. His breathing became faster. A paramedic leaned close. "Mr. Simmons, stay with me." Johnny's lips barely moved. "My team. They're alive." He closed his eyes. That answer mattered more than anything else. The helicopter blades thundered overhead. Minutes later, the aircraft lifted toward Columbus. Inside the emergency cabin, machines replaced silence, an IV line, cardiac monitor, oxygen mask. A trauma surgeon spoke with Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center through the radio. Male 39. Suspected thoracic spinal injury, multiple fractures, severe blunt force trauma. Johnny drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time he opened his eyes, Another ceiling passed above him. Emergency department, CT scanner, operating room, recovery hallway. Hours disappeared. When morning finally arrived, sunlight filtered softly through the intensive care unit window. Peyton sat beside the bed. Her eyes were red from crying. She reached for Johnny's hand. "I thought I lost you." Johnny managed a weak smile. "So did I." For the first 2 weeks, Peyton never missed a hospital visit. She brought fresh clothes. She answered calls from coworkers. She thanked every nurse. She assured everyone that Johnny was strong enough to survive anything. Johnny believed her. He wanted to. 3 weeks later, the lead spinal surgeon, Dr. Melissa Grant, entered the room carrying MRI scans. She pulled a chair beside the bed instead of remaining standing. Johnny noticed that immediately. Doctors only sat down when conversations became difficult. She placed the images across the bedside table. "The surgery stabilized your spine." Johnny listened without speaking. "The swelling has decreased." He nodded once. Dr. Grant folded her hands. "I wish I had better news." Silence filled the room. "The damage to your spinal cord is extensive." Johnny stared at the ceiling. "We're going to begin rehabilitation as soon as you're medically ready." He looked toward her. "And walking." Dr. Grant held his gaze for several long seconds before answering. "We have to prepare for the possibility." She paused carefully. "That you may never walk again." The room became perfectly still. Even the steady rhythm of the heart monitor suddenly sounded unbearably loud. The first month after Dr. Melissa Grant delivered her diagnosis passed inside a carefully organized routine that left very little room for hope. Every morning at 7, a rehabilitation nurse entered Johnny Simmons' room with medication, followed by a physical therapist exactly 30 minutes later. Every afternoon brought another round of exercises, neurological evaluations, and endless measurements that rarely showed meaningful improvement. Johnny never asked how long recovery would take anymore. He had learned that everyone used different words to avoid saying the same thing. "We'll see. Progress takes time. Every patient is different." No one promised he would walk again. Instead, they celebrated smaller victories. The first time he managed to sit upright without becoming dizzy. The first time he transferred from the hospital bed into a wheelchair without assistance from 2 nurses. The first time he wheeled himself 50 feet down the rehabilitation hallway. Other patients smiled after reaching those milestones. Johnny simply nodded before asking for the next exercise. Pain had become part of the schedule. So had silence. Every afternoon, Peyton arrived carrying fresh clothes, homemade meals, or paperwork from home. During those first weeks, she smiled often. She adjusted his blanket. She reminded him that everything would be okay. She answered calls from coworkers at Franklin Engineering Group. She assured clients Johnny would eventually return. Johnny noticed the effort. He appreciated it. But he also noticed something else. She stopped talking about the future. Before the accident, they had spoken constantly about plans, buying a lake cabin near Buckeye Lake, taking a 2-week road trip through Montana, renovating the kitchen, having children. Now every conversation remained trapped inside the present. "Did you sleep? Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" Small questions. Safe questions. Questions that ended quickly. One afternoon, Ryan Cooper visited after work. His right arm remained wrapped in a sling from injuries sustained during the collapse. He entered the rehabilitation room carrying a thick binder. Johnny recognized it immediately. "The inspection report." Ryan smiled. "The final investigation." Johnny opened it carefully. Photographs, engineering diagrams, laboratory analyses, failure calculations. Exactly what he expected. Ryan pulled up a chair. "They ruled it a hidden fatigue fracture inside the lower tension member." Johnny nodded slowly. "I figured." They're calling you a hero. Johnny looked away. The others survived. Because you pushed me. Johnny closed the report. You'll do the same for someone else one day. Ryan laughed quietly. You always make everything sound simple. It usually is. Ryan's expression became serious. The company says your position will be waiting. Johnny remained silent for several seconds. I appreciate that. Neither man mentioned the wheelchair standing beside the bed. They didn't need to. After Ryan left, Peyton stared at the closed hospital door. He really believes you'll go back, Johnny answered honestly. So do I. She forced a smile. I hope so. Hope. It sounded different coming from her now. Less certain, almost borrowed. Weeks became months. Johnny transferred to an inpatient rehabilitation center outside Columbus. His schedule became even harder. Strength training, balance exercises, occupational therapy, neurological stimulation. Every tiny movement demanded enormous effort. Simple tasks became daily battles. Buttoning a shirt, holding a coffee mug steady, rolling across uneven pavement, opening heavy doors. Nothing happened automatically anymore. One rainy afternoon, Johnny wheeled himself toward the rehabilitation gym and noticed Peyton standing outside the building speaking quietly on her cell phone. She turned away when she saw him. The conversation ended immediately. She smiled too quickly. Everything okay? She slipped the phone into her purse. Just talking with my sister. Johnny nodded. He never questioned it. 3 days later, she missed her usual visit. The following week, she canceled dinner because she felt exhausted. Then another appointment, then another. The pattern grew slowly enough that almost anyone else might have ignored it. Johnny noticed because engineering had trained him to recognize patterns before they became failures. One missing visit, then 2, then 4. The explanations remained reasonable. Work meetings, traffic, headaches, family obligations. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed something else. During physical therapy, Johnny pushed himself harder than before. His therapists admired the determination. Only Johnny knew why. If his life had changed permanently, then he refused to let his discipline change with it. One evening, he returned home temporarily for the first time. The house looked exactly as they had left it. His coffee mug remained beside the kitchen sink. Blueprints still covered the dining room table. A framed vacation photograph from Yellowstone stood above the fireplace. Everything looked familiar. Nothing felt familiar. The wheelchair barely fit through the hallway. The bathroom required new support rails. Door thresholds suddenly became obstacles. Johnny measured each difficulty without complaint. He wrote improvements inside another notebook. Ramp angle, counter height, bathroom clearance, engineers solved problems. That habit had survived the accident. Peyton watched quietly. You don't have to write everything down. It helps. You should rest. I will. Instead, he continued measuring. That night, Johnny woke shortly after midnight. The bedroom beside him was empty. He rolled into the hallway. Soft light spilled from beneath the office door. Peyton sat alone behind the desk. Stacks of unopened bills covered the surface. She closed a folder immediately after noticing him. I couldn't sleep. Johnny nodded. Everything all right? Just organizing finances. He accepted the answer, but he noticed one detail. The folder disappeared into her briefcase before breakfast. Over the next several weeks, the financial pressure became impossible to ignore. Insurance covered much of Johnny's emergency care. Not all of it. Specialized rehabilitation equipment, home modifications, follow-up surgeries, physical therapy beyond standard coverage. Invoices accumulated steadily. Johnny reviewed every statement himself. He never panicked. He simply calculated. Peyton stopped discussing money entirely. Whenever another bill arrived, she quietly placed it inside a kitchen drawer. Johnny noticed the drawer becoming harder to close. Friends also began disappearing. At first, everyone called. Then weekly messages became monthly. Eventually, conversations ended with promises to visit soon. Soon rarely arrived. Only Ryan continued visiting regularly. Sometimes Lucas Miller joined him. They never treated Johnny differently. They discussed bridge projects, engineering news, football, politics, normal conversations. Johnny appreciated normal more than encouragement. One Friday afternoon, Ryan mentioned something without realizing its importance. "I ran into Benjamin Carter downtown." Johnny looked up. "The divorce attorney," Ryan shrugged. "Yeah." Said he was leaving the courthouse. Johnny simply nodded. He thought nothing more about it. 2 weeks later, he noticed Benjamin Carter's name printed across an envelope lying partially hidden beneath several magazines on the kitchen counter. Peyton entered before he could read anything else. She picked up the envelope almost instantly. "Wrong address." Johnny looked at her. "The law office?" "They sent something for a previous client." She smiled. The explanation sounded prepared. Johnny said nothing. That evening, he opened his engineering notebook instead of asking questions. On one page, he drew the cross-section of a bridge support. On the opposite page, he wrote only one sentence: "Stress reveals weaknesses long before collapse." He closed the notebook. Outside, autumn rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, another kind of storm continued building without a sound. The following Tuesday, Peyton dressed more formally than usual. Navy business suit, leather portfolio, minimal jewelry. Johnny watched her collect her car keys. "Big meeting." She hesitated only briefly. "Just work?" He smiled politely. "Drive safely." She left. Johnny rolled toward the front window. Her car drove in the opposite direction from her office. He watched until it disappeared around the corner. Then he quietly turned back toward the empty living room. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to consider a possibility more painful than paralysis. Maybe the bridge hadn't been the only thing that was slowly falling apart. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, only the quiet knock of a courier at exactly 10:18 a.m. Johnny Simmons rolled his wheelchair toward the front door, balancing carefully as he reached for the handle. The courier offered a polite smile before handing him a large, certified envelope. "Mr. Johnny Simmons," Johnny signed electronically. The courier thanked him and walked back toward his delivery van. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Johnny closed the door and placed the envelope on the kitchen table. He stared at it for almost 5 minutes before opening it. Not because he was afraid, because he preferred reading difficult things only once. The return address belonged to Carter and Associates Family Law, Benjamin Carter. Ryan Cooper had mentioned seeing him weeks earlier. Johnny quietly unfolded the documents: petition for dissolution of marriage, financial disclosures, property division proposals, medical responsibility clauses. Everything had already been prepared. Every signature except his own was already in place. He continued reading until the final page. Then he carefully stacked every document back into perfect order. No anger crossed his face, only silence. That afternoon, Peyton returned home carrying groceries. She stopped walking the moment she saw the envelope on the table. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Peyton placed the grocery bags on the counter. "I was going to tell you." Johnny nodded once. "I know." "I'm sorry." Again, he nodded. The words sounded sincere, but they also sounded late. She slowly sat across from him. "I didn't want you finding out this way." Johnny looked at the paperwork again. "I probably wasn't supposed to." "No." Another silence settled between them. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, the heating system clicked on. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary afternoon. Nothing about the room suggested that a marriage of 11 years was ending. Peyton folded her hands together. This isn't because of one thing. Johnny listened. It's been everything. He waited. I don't think I'm strong enough. Still, he said nothing. She searched his face for anger. It never came. I didn't expect our life to become hospitals. Therapy? Wheelchairs? Johnny lowered his eyes toward the paperwork. I know. I kept telling myself things would get better. Another pause. They didn't. Johnny finally spoke. They got different. Peyton looked away. Maybe. Neither of them mentioned love. Not once. Perhaps because both understood that love had not disappeared overnight. It had simply worn away beneath thousands of ordinary disappointments neither of them had anticipated. Johnny reached for the first page. When did you hire Benjamin Carter? She hesitated. About 6 weeks ago. I figured. You knew. I noticed patterns. A sad smile crossed Peyton's face. You always notice patterns. Johnny signed the first page, then the second, then another. His handwriting remained steady despite the weakness in his hands. Peyton watched quietly. I thought you'd fight this. Johnny capped the pen. For what? Our marriage. He looked at her calmly. A marriage isn't protected by a courtroom. She lowered her eyes. He continued. If someone has already decided to leave, a judge can't change that. The words carried no bitterness, only acceptance. That somehow made them heavier. Peyton wiped away a tear. I'm sorry. Johnny offered a faint smile. I believe you. He meant it. He believed she felt guilty. He simply didn't believe guilt could rebuild what had already collapsed. Over the next 2 weeks, they divided their lives with surprising efficiency. Furniture, savings, retirement accounts, vehicles, the Columbus house. Johnny insisted the process remain simple. He refused unnecessary legal battles. Benjamin Carter seemed almost surprised during the settlement meeting. Most divorces involved arguments. Johnny asked only practical questions. What date is the property transfer? When does the insurance coverage change? Which documents need notarization? Benjamin finally removed his reading glasses. Mr. Simmons, Johnny looked up. Yes. I've handled family law for 23 years. Johnny waited. I've never seen someone remain this calm, Johnny answered without hesitation. I've already survived the hardest day of my life. Benjamin didn't know how to respond. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. A week afterward, Peyton began packing. The sound of cardboard boxes filled the house from morning until evening. Johnny remained inside his home office reviewing engineering notebooks, not because he wanted to avoid her, because there was nothing left to negotiate. Occasionally, she asked practical questions. Do you want the dining table? No. What about the guest bedroom furniture? Keep it. The television? Doesn't matter. Each answer became shorter, not cold, simply finished. Ryan visited one Saturday carrying sandwiches from their favorite deli. He immediately noticed the stacked moving boxes. He looked toward Johnny. Neither man spoke until Peyton stepped outside to load another car. Ryan finally asked quietly, Is it really happening? Johnny nodded. Ryan leaned back in his chair. I'm sorry. Johnny smiled faintly. You don't have to be. Ryan frowned. How can you say that? Johnny looked toward the front window where Peyton was carrying another box. People make decisions based on what they believe they can live with. And you're okay with that? No. Ryan remained silent. But understanding something isn't the same as agreeing with it. Ryan shook his head. I'd be furious. Johnny looked at the engineering notebook lying open beside him. The bridge didn't collapse because I got angry. Ryan blinked. It collapsed because the steel failed. Johnny tapped the notebook lightly. I've spent my whole career studying failures. Ryan slowly understood. You don't blame the steel. I study why it broke. Late that evening after Ryan left, Johnny wheeled himself through each room of the house. The living room looked larger without several pieces of furniture. The bookshelves had empty spaces. Photographs had disappeared from the walls. The kitchen echoed differently. Absence had its own sound. He stopped beside the fireplace. Only one framed photograph remained. Their 10th wedding anniversary. Taken during a weekend trip to Asheville, North Carolina, Johnny picked it up. He studied the smiling couple inside the frame. Neither of them knew what waited 2 years ahead. He placed the photograph into a storage box instead of throwing it away. Some memories deserved respect even after they ended. 3 days later, Peyton carried the last suitcase toward the front door. A moving truck idled quietly outside. She paused before leaving. Johnny waited in the hallway. I don't know what else to say. He nodded gently. You've already said enough. She looked around the house one final time. I hope someday. Her voice faded. Johnny spared her from finishing the sentence. I hope so too. She stepped closer. For a moment it seemed she might hug him. Instead, she simply touched his shoulder. I'm glad you survived. Johnny looked into her eyes. So am I. She opened the front door. Bright afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. The moving truck driver loaded the final suitcase. Its rear door slammed shut. The engine started. Johnny remained exactly where he was. He watched through the front window as Peyton climbed into her SUV. She never looked back. The vehicles disappeared slowly down the quiet suburban street. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The house became impossibly still. No footsteps upstairs, no television, no conversations drifting from another room. Only the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock standing beside the staircase. Johnny rolled himself into the kitchen. 2 coffee mugs still rested inside the cabinet. He removed one, then the other. He placed Peyton's mug carefully into a cardboard box labeled storage. His own mug went beside the coffee maker. Tomorrow morning he would still wake up at 5:15. He would still drink black coffee. He would still fill another engineering notebook. Because routines survived even when marriages didn't. As evening settled over Columbus, Johnny wheeled toward the home office one final time. Dozens of engineering journals lined the shelves. Old bridge blueprints filled filing cabinets. One locked drawer remained unopened since before the accident. He rested his hand on the drawer handle. Inside were documents Peyton had never seen. Research files, patent applications, design notebooks dating back 7 years, work that almost nobody knew existed. For the first time since leaving the hospital, Johnny unlocked the drawer. He slowly removed the thick blue binder resting on top. Stamped across the cover were 2 simple words: Project Sentinel. Johnny carried the blue binder into his home office and closed the door behind him. The room had barely changed in years. 3 floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with engineering textbooks, federal bridge inspection manuals, and binders labeled by year. A drafting table stood beside the window overlooking the backyard. Even after computers became standard throughout the industry, Johnny continued sketching his earliest ideas with a pencil before transferring them into digital models. The blue binder rested in the center of the desk. Project Sentinel. He opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten notes dated nearly 7 years earlier. Flowcharts, sensor layouts, mathematical models, bridge vibration patterns, photographs from inspection sites across Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Every page documented the same obsession. How could engineers detect catastrophic structural failure before human inspectors ever noticed visible damage? The question had haunted Johnny for years. He had investigated dozens of bridge failures throughout the Midwest. Each investigation reached similar conclusions. Small warning signs always appeared first. Microscopic cracks, abnormal vibration, minute changes in steel resonance, temperature variations, tiny distortions measured in fractions of a millimeter. The problem was never the absence of warning. The problem was that no system connected every warning into one complete picture. Human inspectors visited bridges only several times each year. Damage never waited for schedules. Johnny believed the bridge itself should report when something was wrong. Not 6 months later, not after visible cracks appeared. Immediately. His first notebook described an idea almost everyone dismissed as unrealistic. Thousands of miniature sensors permanently installed inside critical bridge components. Continuous vibration monitoring. Artificial intelligence comparing live structural behavior against millions of historical engineering calculations. Automatic alerts before dangerous fatigue became visible. When Johnny first presented the concept internally at Franklin Engineering Group, several executives politely applauded. Then they quietly moved on. Too expensive, too complicated, too ambitious. One senior manager had smiled during the meeting. "Johnny, bridges don't talk," Johnny had answered calmly. "They already do." The room had laughed. He never argued. Instead, he continued building the system privately after work, night after night, weekend after weekend. 7 years, thousands of hours. He paid patent attorneys himself, purchased laboratory equipment with personal savings, partnered quietly with university researchers under confidentiality agreements, never seeking publicity, never discussing the project at dinner. Even Peyton knew only that Johnny often worked late. She never saw the complete design. He preferred that. Until the technology became real, he believed it deserved protection rather than attention. Johnny reached another section inside the binder. United States Patent Office. Patent granted. 3 years before the bridge accident. Another patent, 18 months later, then another. 5 separate patents. Everyone registered solely under Johnny Simmons. Not Franklin Engineering Group. Not any corporation. Him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Johnny closed the binder. "Come in." The door opened slowly. A tall man with silver hair stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Dr. Richard Hayes, 71 years old, former professor of structural engineering at Ohio State University, retired consultant, Johnny's mentor since college. Richard smiled warmly. "I figured you'd still take your coffee black." Johnny accepted the cup. "You remembered." "I remember everything worth remembering." Richard glanced toward the blue binder. "So," Johnny nodded. "It's time." Richard sat across from him. "I wondered how long you'd wait." Johnny looked toward the window. "I needed everything else settled first." "The divorce," Johnny nodded again. Richard didn't offer sympathy. He understood Johnny too well. Instead, he asked, "How are you?" Johnny considered the question carefully. "My back still hurts." "I wasn't asking about your back." Johnny allowed himself a faint smile. "I know." Richard leaned back. "Same answer." Johnny looked at the binder. "I'm still here." For Richard Hayes, that answer carried enormous meaning. Many people survived tragedy physically. Much fewer survived mentally. Johnny had never stopped thinking like an engineer. That alone gave Richard confidence. He opened another folder from his briefcase. "The Department of Transportation finished reviewing your preliminary proposal." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "So quickly." "They've been watching longer than you realize." Johnny studied the documents. Several pages carried federal letterheads, engineering evaluation committees, infrastructure modernization initiatives, confidential correspondence. Richard folded his hands. "They're interested." Johnny remained expressionless. "How interested?" Richard slid 1 page across the desk. "Official invitation. Confidential technology demonstration. United States Department of Transportation. Washington, D.C." Johnny read every line twice. They want a live demonstration. They do. Using an active bridge. Richard smiled. Not just any bridge. He pointed toward another document. The Jefferson Memorial Bridge outside Pittsburgh. A major interstate crossing currently undergoing scheduled maintenance. Federal engineers wanted to install Sentinel temporarily during ongoing inspections. The bridge would serve as the first large-scale government evaluation. Johnny closed the folder slowly. They're taking a risk. Richard shook his head. No. They're testing evidence. Johnny appreciated the distinction. Evidence, not promises. Exactly how engineering should work. 2 weeks later, Johnny arrived at a secure federal testing facility outside Pittsburgh. No reporters waited, no television cameras, only engineers, bridge specialists, software analysts, transportation officials. Everyone signed confidentiality agreements before entering. Project Sentinel occupied an entire mobile laboratory. Large computer monitors displayed live structural models, fiber optic sensor feeds, temperature readings, load distributions, artificial intelligence prediction maps. Johnny wheeled himself quietly through the equipment. Nothing impressed him more than seeing years of ideas transformed into reality. A young federal engineer approached. "I'm Karen Mitchell." Johnny shook her hand. "Johnny, I've read every patent." Johnny smiled politely. "My condolences." She laughed. "I mean that as a compliment." Karen led him toward the main monitoring station. "We installed your sensors 48 hours ago." Johnny examined the live display. Thousands of tiny green indicators covered a digital model of the bridge. Each represented an individual monitoring point. Heartbeat-like signals pulsed continuously across the screen. One official joined them. Deputy Transportation Secretary Daniel Foster. "We're ready whenever you are," Johnny nodded toward the monitors. "Let's begin." The first several hours appeared uneventful. Traffic crossed overhead. Heavy trucks, passenger vehicles, maintenance crews. The system continuously updated. Load changes, wind speed, steel expansion, vibration frequencies, everything behaved exactly as expected. Then, shortly after noon, one sensor changed color. Yellow. Karen noticed immediately. Zone C14. Another sensor shifted. Then another. Johnny rolled closer. "What are we seeing?" Karen enlarged the display. Subtle vibration changes inside one lower support assembly. Not dangerous. Not yet. But unusual. Deputy Secretary Foster looked concerned. "Equipment malfunction?" Johnny shook his head. "No." He studied the data. "The bridge is telling us something." Maintenance supervisors inspected the exact location identified by Sentinel. 40 minutes later, they radioed back. "We found a loose anchor connection hidden behind the maintenance housing." Karen stared at Johnny. "It wasn't visible." Johnny smiled slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be." The loose connection wasn't catastrophic. Traffic never stopped. No emergency developed. But federal inspectors later confirmed that months of continued stress would almost certainly have accelerated fatigue throughout that support section. Sentinel had detected the abnormal behavior long before traditional inspection methods. Inside the mobile laboratory, silence filled the room, not uncertainty. Respect. Deputy Secretary Foster extended his hand toward Johnny. "I've spent 30 years around infrastructure." Johnny accepted the handshake. "So have I." Foster nodded toward the monitors. "I've never seen anything like this." Johnny looked at the digital bridge quietly glowing across the screen. "This isn't replacing engineers." "No. No." "What is it replacing?" Johnny answered without hesitation. "Guesswork?" Across the room, Richard Hayes watched his former student carefully. Not celebrating, not boasting, simply presenting evidence, exactly as he always had. Late that evening, after the demonstration officially concluded, federal officials remained inside the conference room, discussing next steps. Johnny gathered his notebooks. As he prepared to leave, Richard walked beside him. "You realize today changes everything." Johnny looked toward the bridge visible through the laboratory window. "No." Richard frowned slightly. Johnny continued. "It only proves the work was worth doing." Hundreds of miles away in Columbus, Peyton attended a dinner party hosted by mutual friends. Someone casually mentioned hearing rumors that Johnny had become involved in another engineering research project. She smiled politely. "Johnny?" The friend shrugged. "That's what I heard." Peyton shook her head. "I doubt it." She had last seen him struggling simply to transfer from his wheelchair into a car. The idea that he might be leading a major engineering breakthrough seemed impossible. She dismissed the conversation within seconds. Back in Pittsburgh, Johnny received another sealed envelope before leaving the facility. It carried no company logo, only the seal of the United States Department of Transportation. Inside was a single page. Project Sentinel had officially advanced to the next phase of federal evaluation. Below the letter rested another document, marked confidential, acquisition interest, submitted by Titan Infrastructure Solutions. Johnny read the company name once, then quietly closed the folder. The real battle had just begun. The first purchase offer arrived 3 days after Johnny returned to Columbus. It came by overnight courier. Heavy cream-colored envelope, embossed company seal, Titan Infrastructure Solutions. Johnny placed the envelope beside his coffee without opening it immediately. Outside, early winter snow covered the backyard. Inside his small rehabilitation apartment, every movement still demanded planning. The apartment was nothing luxurious. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, wider doorways that accommodated his wheelchair. A small office where the blue Project Sentinel binder remained open beside 2 computer monitors. His mornings had become predictable again. Wake at 5:15. Stretch for nearly 30 minutes before attempting to transfer from bed. Prepare black coffee. Review rehabilitation exercises. Spend 4 hours refining Sentinel's software. Physical therapy after lunch. More engineering work until evening. The routine looked repetitive. Johnny preferred it that way. Discipline gave structure to uncertainty. He finally opened Titan's envelope. Inside was a short letter. Mr. Johnny Simmons. Titan Infrastructure Solutions would like to discuss acquiring all intellectual property related to Project Sentinel. We believe our national resources can accelerate deployment for the benefit of America's infrastructure. A preliminary acquisition proposal is enclosed. Johnny unfolded the next page. $42 million. He read the figure twice, not because it impressed him, because it confirmed something Richard Hayes had predicted years earlier. If the technology works, Richard had once said, the first people knocking on your door won't be bridge engineers. They'll be businessmen. Johnny set the papers aside. He wasn't offended. Neither was he tempted. Money had never been the purpose. Preventing bridge failures had been. Later that afternoon, Richard stopped by carrying sandwiches from a small deli they had visited for years. "I heard from Washington," Richard said after sitting down. "So did Titan." Richard smiled knowingly. "How much?" Johnny slid the offer across the table. Richard glanced at the number. "They're starting low." Johnny laughed quietly. "You think $42 million is low?" "For what Sentinel becomes," Richard folded the paper. "It's almost insulting." Johnny looked toward the software running across his monitor. Tiny digital bridges rotated slowly, while simulated traffic crossed each structure. Colored stress maps shifted continuously. "It isn't finished. No revolutionary technology ever is." Richard leaned forward. "Johnny." Johnny looked up. "You need to decide something." "What? Are you building a company?" Johnny considered the question. "I thought I already had." "No." Richard shook his head. "You built an invention." He pointed toward the monitor. Now you need to decide who controls it. The distinction lingered in Johnny's thoughts long after Richard left. For years, he had focused entirely on solving an engineering problem. Business had always come second. Now that had changed. His phone rang shortly before dinner. "Unknown number," Johnny answered. "This is Johnny." A calm female voice replied. "Mr. Simmons, my name is Evelyn Ross." Johnny immediately recognized the name from Titan's proposal. General Counsel, Titan Infrastructure Solutions. "I hope we're not interrupting your evening." "You're not. I wanted to confirm you received our offer." "I did." "And," Johnny answered politely, "I appreciate your interest." A brief silence followed. "We'd be happy to discuss adjustments." "There won't be adjustments." "You haven't heard our revised proposal." "I don't need to." Another pause. "May I ask why—" Johnny looked at the engineering model still rotating across his screen. "Because I'm not selling." Evelyn remained professional. "Every technology has a price." Johnny smiled faintly. "Not every purpose does." The conversation ended respectfully, but something inside Evelyn's tone suggested the matter was far from over. Rehabilitation became even more demanding. Emily Foster introduced herself during Johnny's first appointment at the new outpatient therapy center. She appeared to be in her early 30s, calm, confident, never overly cheerful. Unlike some therapists, she never pretended recovery was easy. She simply expected effort. "Morning, Johnny." "Morning." She reviewed his chart. "I've heard you're stubborn." Johnny smiled. "So have I." Emily pointed toward a set of parallel bars. "Let's see if the rumors are true." The first standing attempt lasted only 8 seconds. Sweat covered Johnny's forehead. Every muscle shook violently. His legs remembered nothing. Emily stayed beside him without touching unless necessary. "Again." Johnny nodded. "Again." 10 seconds. Then 12. Then 9. Failure followed success. Success followed failure. Progress refused to move in straight lines. After nearly an hour, Johnny lowered himself back into the wheelchair. His breathing remained heavy. Emily handed him a towel. "You engineer everything, don't you?" Johnny wiped his forehead. "I try." "You've been tracking every session." She pointed toward a notebook resting beside his water bottle. Inside were dates, exercise repetitions, standing times, pain levels, blood pressure, personal observations. Emily smiled. "Most patients avoid looking at bad days." Johnny closed the notebook. "Bad data is still data." Emily laughed. "I've never heard rehabilitation explained like that." "It isn't rehabilitation?" She raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A long engineering project." Over the following months, Emily began understanding how Johnny's mind worked. When an exercise failed, he didn't become discouraged. He became curious. What changed? What variable mattered? What could be improved tomorrow? Emotion rarely controlled his decisions. Measurement did. One snowy afternoon, Emily adjusted the support harness attached above the parallel bars. "I think you're ready?" Johnny looked ahead. "For what?" "Less support." He nodded. "Let's try." The harness loosened. Johnny gripped the bars tightly. One breath, another. Then he pushed upward. His knees trembled violently. Every muscle protested. Emily remained only inches away. "You've got it." Johnny stood. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but independently. 15 seconds. 20. 25. The longest yet. He slowly lowered himself back down. Emily smiled. "I'll take that." Johnny simply wrote another number inside the notebook. 27 seconds. Progress. Nothing more, nothing less. Across town, Peyton's life looked completely different. She had accepted a management position with a regional medical equipment distributor. Longer hours, business dinners, networking events. Her apartment overlooked downtown Columbus. Modern furniture replaced the old family home. Most evenings, she convinced herself she had made the practical decision. She avoided driving past the neighborhood where she and Johnny had once lived. Mutual friends gradually stopped mentioning him. She rarely asked. Then, one evening, she attended a charity fundraiser hosted by several local construction companies. While waiting near the buffet, she overheard two executives talking. "That engineer from Columbus." "You mean Simmons?" "Yeah. I heard Washington's interested." Peyton looked up. Surely they couldn't mean Johnny. Another executive joined the conversation. "They say Titan offered serious money." The first man shrugged. "Rumors." Peyton quietly walked away before hearing more. Rumors spread constantly in business circles. She dismissed them. Johnny couldn't possibly be leading a national technology project while struggling through rehabilitation. The idea simply didn't fit the image she still carried. Back at Titan Infrastructure Solutions headquarters in Chicago, Charles Whitmore studied a confidential report. Company analysts had reviewed Sentinel's demonstration in Pittsburgh through industry contacts. The conclusions disturbed him. Projected market value: several $billion. Potential federal adoption. International licensing opportunities. He looked toward Evelyn Ross. "I don't like competitors." "He isn't really a competitor." Charles looked up. "Not yet." Evelyn folded her hands. "He refused the offer." Charles smiled. "Everyone refuses the first offer." "I don't think he's negotiating." Charles walked toward the window overlooking downtown Chicago. "What do you know about Johnny Simmons?" Evelyn opened another folder. "Quiet. Brilliant. Highly respected. No history of litigation. Very private." Charles nodded slowly. "And vulnerable." Evelyn understood immediately. "Because of the accident." Charles smiled without answering. His silence carried enough meaning. The following Friday, Johnny completed another rehabilitation session. Emily stood beside him as he prepared for one final exercise. "No harness today." Johnny looked surprised. "You sure?" "I am." He positioned himself between the parallel bars, hands gripping firmly, feet planted carefully. One controlled breath. He pushed upward. Pain surged through his back. His knees shook. His vision blurred for a second. But he remained standing. Emily deliberately stepped backward. "You don't need me." Johnny realized she was right. For nearly half a minute, he stood completely on his own. No harness. No hands supporting his shoulders. Only the bars beneath his grip. He looked down at his legs. 2 years earlier, doctors had warned he might never stand again. Now he was standing. Not walking. Not yet. But standing. As he slowly lowered himself into the wheelchair, Emily smiled. "I think it's time we set a new goal." Johnny closed his notebook. "What goal?" Emily looked directly at him. "Your first step." Johnny didn't answer. Instead, he opened the notebook and wrote only 3 words across the next empty page. "Walk without witnesses." He closed the notebook before anyone else could read it. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and with every passing week, Johnny Simmons measured improvement in numbers rather than emotions. 32 seconds standing without assistance. 41, 53, then 1 minute. The numbers filled another notebook. Each page represented evidence. Evidence mattered. Feelings changed every day. Facts remained. Emily Foster noticed the pattern during one therapy session. "You've filled another notebook." Johnny smiled while writing the date. "Almost." "How many is there now?" He looked toward the shelf inside his rehabilitation locker. 37. Emily laughed. "Most people keep journals." I do. No. She shook her head. You keep engineering reports. Johnny considered that. Probably. She watched him close the notebook. I've been wondering something. What? Have you ever had a day where you wanted to quit? Johnny answered honestly. Several. And? I came back the next morning. Emily nodded. That's the important part. Across the country, Titan Infrastructure Solutions had stopped trying to purchase Project Sentinel, at least officially. Instead, Charles Whitmore instructed his legal department to investigate every public record connected to Johnny Simmons. Patent registrations, employment agreements, academic collaborations, government filings, corporate disclosures, anything. Inside Titan's Chicago headquarters, Evelyn Ross entered the executive conference room carrying a thick folder. We've reviewed everything. Charles looked up. And the patents belong to Johnny. No shared ownership. None. No employer claims none. Charles frowned. What about Franklin Engineering Group? They never funded the research. He leaned back in his chair. So we're out of options. Evelyn hesitated. Not exactly. Charles waited. We found something interesting. She placed several copies of old engineering contracts on the table. Johnny documented every stage of development. Charles skimmed the pages. So, he documented almost too much. Charles slowly smiled. If someone questioned the timeline... Evelyn finished the thought. The burden would fall on him to defend years of work. Charles looked toward the city skyline. Sometimes winning doesn't require being right. He turned back. It only requires making someone spend enough time proving they are. 2 weeks later, Johnny received another certified envelope. Different law firm, different city, same purpose. Patent infringement allegations. Johnny quietly read each page. Titan claimed that several design principles used in Sentinel overlapped with proprietary monitoring technologies already under corporate development. The accusations were vague, carefully written, legally expensive. Richard Hayes arrived less than an hour later after receiving Johnny's phone call. He finished reading the complaint. They're fishing. Johnny nodded. They don't have evidence. No? Richard closed the folder. They're hoping you don't either. Johnny wheeled himself toward a large gray filing cabinet standing against the office wall. Without speaking, he unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside rested dozens of numbered binders, each labeled by year. Richard smiled. I forgot how organized you are. Johnny removed the oldest binder. Then another. Then another. 7 years of development. Every notebook dated, every drawing signed, every software revision archived, every laboratory invoice preserved, emails printed, research contracts, witness signatures, photographs, prototype testing logs. Richard slowly looked across the growing stacks of documents. They're finished. Johnny looked confused. The lawsuit? Richard nodded. They just don't know it yet. The following Monday, Johnny met Rebecca Collins for the first time. Her office overlooked downtown Columbus. Unlike many attorneys, Rebecca displayed very little decoration. No oversized awards, no expensive artwork, only shelves filled with legal reference books and framed court admissions. She greeted Johnny with a firm handshake. I've reviewed everything Richard sent. Johnny nodded. And Rebecca smiled. I almost feel guilty charging you. Johnny raised an eyebrow. Why? Because this may be the most thoroughly documented invention I've ever seen. She opened one notebook. Who told you to keep all this? No one. You did this naturally, Johnny nodded. I'm an engineer. Rebecca laughed. I can tell. She flipped through another binder. Daily notes. Another. Prototype photographs. Another. Version history. She looked back at Johnny. You even documented failed ideas. They're part of the process. Rebecca leaned back. Exactly. She closed the final binder. Most inventors only preserve successful work. Johnny remained silent. They accidentally create gaps. She tapped the stack. You created a timeline. What does that mean? It means facts can testify. Several weeks later, the first pre-trial conference began in federal court. No jury yet, only procedural hearings. Titan's attorneys argued confidently. Johnny listened quietly from beside Rebecca. Charles Whitmore attended personally. He never looked directly at Johnny. Rebecca whispered, "Remember." Johnny nodded. No emotion. She smiled. I wasn't worried. The judge requested preliminary evidence schedules. Titan promised technical experts, corporate research records, internal development timelines. Rebecca stood. The defense intends to present original engineering journals, patent histories, federal testing records, and chronological research documentation covering more than 7 years. Several attorneys looked toward Johnny. Rebecca continued. The documentation exceeds 12,000 pages. Even Titan's legal team exchanged brief glances. Charles Whitmore's expression remained calm, but only on the surface. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The lawsuit had begun attracting attention inside engineering publications, not because of celebrity, because infrastructure technology rarely reached federal litigation. One journalist approached Rebecca. Does Mr. Simmons intend to settle? Rebecca answered before Johnny spoke. No. Is Titan offering additional compensation? That question assumes something is for sale. Johnny quietly entered the waiting vehicle without commenting. Reporters shouted more questions. He ignored everyone. Inside the car, Rebecca smiled. You're making my job easy. Johnny looked out the window. I don't have anything to add. Exactly. That evening, Ryan Cooper visited the apartment carrying pizza. I saw you on the news. Johnny laughed quietly. So did I. Ryan sat down. You looked calm. I was. I'd have been terrified. Johnny opened the pizza box. They're arguing about paperwork. Ryan stared at him. Billions of dollars worth of paperwork. Johnny shrugged. Still paperwork. Ryan shook his head. I don't know how your brain works. Johnny smiled. It usually works 1 page at a time. Ryan looked toward the office, where stacks of binders covered nearly every shelf. I remember those notebooks. Johnny followed his gaze. So do I. You carried them everywhere. They mattered, Ryan laughed. I used to think you were obsessive. Johnny took another bite. You were right. Ryan frowned. No. Johnny nodded. Sometimes obsession is another word for preparation. A few days later, Rebecca called with unexpected news. You'll appreciate this, Johnny answered. What happened? Titan requested copies of your original journals. Johnny smiled slightly. They're curious. Rebecca laughed. No. They're worried. She paused. There's something else. What? They discovered an old property acknowledgement signed during your marriage. Johnny tried remembering. What acknowledgement? When you filed one of your early patents. Rebecca searched through her notes. The document confirms your intellectual property remained solely yours. Johnny nodded slowly. I remember signing, Rebecca continued. Peyton signed as your spouse. Johnny thought back several years. A small notary office, routine paperwork, nothing memorable. He had never imagined the document would matter. Rebecca closed the file. That signature removes another argument. Johnny remained quiet. Titan can't claim ownership through marital property confusion. He looked toward the old patent binders. So even ordinary paperwork matters. Rebecca smiled. In court, she answered immediately. Everything matters. After ending the call, Johnny wheeled himself into his office. He stood before the shelves filled with years of careful records. Every notebook represented another ordinary day, another small observation, another forgotten calculation. None of them had seemed important when he wrote them. Together they had become something stronger than memory. They had become proof. Johnny reached for the oldest notebook. On the first page, written 7 years earlier, appeared one sentence in his own handwriting. Facts leave permanent records. He quietly closed the notebook. For the first time since the lawsuit began, he allowed himself a small, confident smile. The trial date had finally been scheduled, and this time the evidence would speak louder than anyone in the courtroom. The federal courthouse in Columbus carried a different kind of silence than the rehabilitation center. In rehabilitation, silence meant effort. Inside a courtroom, silence meant anticipation. Johnny Simmons arrived 40 minutes early. Rebecca Collins believed punctuality created its own quiet advantage. If we're never rushed, she had told him, we'll never look unprepared. Johnny agreed. Preparation had shaped his entire life. He rolled into the courtroom wearing a dark charcoal suit tailored to fit comfortably while seated in his wheelchair. His notebooks were absent today. They no longer needed to be carried. Every important page had already been scanned, indexed, authenticated, and entered into evidence. Across the aisle, Titan Infrastructure Solutions occupied nearly 2 full rows. Corporate executives, technical consultants, 3 attorneys. Charles Whitmore sat quietly near the front. His expression revealed nothing. Rebecca leaned towards Johnny. Remember, Johnny nodded. Answer only what's asked. I know. And don't help them. A faint smile crossed Johnny's face. I never do. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Johnny remained seated. The proceedings began. Titan's lead attorney opened confidently. Ladies and gentlemen, innovation rarely occurs in isolation. He walked slowly before the jury. Large corporations invest billions of dollars into research every year. He displayed technical diagrams on a courtroom screen. Our position is simple. He paused. Mr. Simmons incorporated concepts already under development inside Titan Infrastructure Solutions. The presentation lasted nearly an hour. Charts, timelines, corporate research budgets, internal engineering memoranda, everything sounded impressive. Rebecca took almost no notes, Johnny noticed. She had already predicted every argument. When Titan finished, the judge nodded toward Rebecca. Defense? Rebecca stood calmly. The defense calls Johnny Simmons. Johnny moved toward the witness stand using the courtroom access ramp. After taking the oath, he settled comfortably into position. Rebecca approached. Mr. Simmons? Yes. What is your profession? Structural engineer. How long? 19 years. What inspired Project Sentinel? Johnny answered without hesitation. Bridge failures. Rebecca displayed a photograph of the collapsed Franklin River Bridge. What did that accident teach you? Johnny looked briefly at the image. That warning signs exist long before disasters. And before your accident, I already believed continuous monitoring could save lives. Rebecca nodded. When did that belief begin? Johnny looked toward the evidence table. 7 years before the accident. Rebecca smiled. No further questions. The simplicity surprised nearly everyone. Titan's attorney immediately rose. Mr. Simmons. Good morning. You claim Project Sentinel originated 7 years before your accident. Correct. You expect that this jury to believe you developed an advanced artificial intelligence infrastructure system almost entirely alone, Johnny answered calmly. No. The attorney blinked. No. I worked with university researchers. The attorney smiled. So you admit others contributed? They contributed research? Exactly. Johnny waited. They didn't invent Sentinel. The attorney changed direction. Isn't it true your employer had access to your ideas? Some ideas. And those ideas could have reached Titan. Johnny looked directly at him. Could they? The attorney frowned. I'm asking you. Johnny remained composed. I don't speculate. Several jurors exchanged quick glances. The attorney shifted again. You documented everything. Yes. Every day. Almost. Convenient, Johnny answered quietly. Consistent. The attorney walked toward the evidence table. Let's discuss these famous notebooks. He held one in the air. Dozens of handwritten journals. Johnny nodded. Yes. How can anyone verify you didn't create them later? Rebecca remained seated. She didn't object. She wanted Johnny to answer. Johnny looked toward the judge. May I explain? The judge nodded. You may. Johnny spoke slowly. Each notebook contains dated engineering calculations, he continued. The calculations reference weather conditions. Another pause. Construction schedules. He looked toward the jury. Federal inspection reports. The notebooks also contain laboratory receipts, email printouts, digital backup references, university meeting agendas. He folded his hands. To fake one notebook would require rewriting 7 years of my life. Silence settled across the courtroom. Titan's attorney changed subjects again. You were seriously injured? Yes. Emotionally vulnerable? I imagine so. So perhaps your memory isn't perfect. Johnny answered immediately. That's why I wrote everything down. Even the judge looked up from his notes. After lunch, Rebecca called another witness, Ryan Cooper. Ryan walked confidently toward the stand. He adjusted the microphone. Rebecca smiled. Mr. Cooper. Yes. How do you know Johnny Simmons? He hired me. When? Almost 8 years ago. What kind of engineer was he? Ryan laughed softly. The most organized person I've ever met. The courtroom chuckled. Rebecca continued. Can you explain? Ryan nodded. If Johnny solved a problem on Monday, he'd still have the notes 10 years later. Laughter spread lightly again. Ryan became serious. I used to tease him. Rebecca asked, about what? The notebooks. What did he say? Ryan smiled. He always told me memory eventually lies. Rebecca nodded. And paper doesn't, Ryan answered. Paper remembers. Titan's attorney stood for cross-examination. Mr. Cooper. Yes. You admire Mr. Simmons? I do. So you're biased? Ryan shrugged. I also admire seatbelts. The courtroom laughed again. The attorney frowned. Answer the question. Ryan became serious. I respect evidence. No further questions. The following witness surprised nearly everyone. Dr. Richard Hayes, retired professor. Former consultant. Mentor. Rebecca approached him gently. Professor Hayes. When did you first hear about Project Sentinel? Richard smiled. During breakfast. The jury looked confused. He continued, about 7 years ago. Johnny showed me a rough sketch on a napkin. Rebecca displayed the actual napkin inside a protective evidence sleeve. Dated, signed, photographed years earlier. Several jurors leaned forward. Richard looked toward the sketch. I told him it looked impossible. Rebecca smiled. What did he say? Richard answered without hesitation. Then I should probably start working. The courtroom remained silent. Titan's attorneys quietly reviewed their own notes. Their timeline had begun showing cracks. On the second day of testimony, Rebecca presented something nobody expected. Boxes. 38 identical archive boxes, each carefully labeled. Rebecca looked towards the judge. "Your Honor." She gestured towards the evidence. "The defense requests permission to demonstrate the complete development archive." The judge approved. Court staff opened the first box, then another, then another. Engineering notebooks, original prototype components, printed source code, laboratory photographs, patent correspondence, university collaboration agreements, government testing records. 7 years. Stacked physically before the jury. Rebecca didn't dramatize the moment. She simply asked, "Mr. Simmons?" "Yes." "What are these?" Johnny answered quietly. "My work. Nothing more, nothing less." The jury looked across the mountain of evidence. No one spoke. Titan's attorneys suddenly appeared much smaller. Late that afternoon, Charles Whitmore requested a private meeting with Evelyn Ross inside an empty conference room. He closed the door. "How bad?" Evelyn answered honestly. "Worse than expected." Charles crossed his arms. "The jury likes him. They trust him. Same difference." She shook her head. "No. They don't trust him because he's sympathetic." Charles waited. "They trust him because every answer matches the documents." Silence followed. Charles finally asked, "Settlement?" Evelyn hesitated. "Now." "Yes." She looked directly at him. "He may not accept." Charles stared out the window, overlooking the courthouse. "I don't think he's interested in money anymore." That evening, Rebecca met Johnny in a small conference room. She placed a document on the table. Titan's first settlement proposal. Confidential. Financial compensation, patent licensing, joint ownership. Rebecca folded her hands. "They're blinking." Johnny read every page, then quietly returned the offer. "No." Rebecca wasn't surprised. "You didn't even ask the number." Johnny looked toward the courthouse windows where the last sunlight faded behind downtown Columbus. "This stopped being about money the moment they accused me of stealing my own work." Rebecca nodded. "I thought you'd say that." Johnny looked down at his hands. For nearly 2 years, those hands had struggled to hold a coffee cup. Now, those same hands held the truth of 7 years' labor. Not perfectly steady, but steady enough. Rebecca gathered the papers. "Tomorrow they cross their fingers." Johnny looked at the courtroom doors beyond the hallway. "No," he answered quietly. "Tomorrow they face the evidence." Outside, reporters prepared for another day of headlines. Inside the courthouse, 38 archive boxes remained under court security. Each box held ordinary pages. Together they carried something extraordinary. Not revenge, not anger, only proof. And in Johnny Simmons' world, proof had always been stronger than opinion. The third morning of the trial began differently. Titan Infrastructure Solutions no longer looked confident. Their attorneys spoke more quietly. Corporate executives whispered among themselves before taking their seats. Even Charles Whitmore spent several minutes studying documents without once looking toward Johnny Simmons, Rebecca Collins noticed immediately. "They've changed strategy." Johnny adjusted the sleeves of his suit. "How?" "They're no longer trying to prove they invented Sentinel." He looked toward Titan's table. "What are they trying to prove?" Rebecca answered calmly. "That your documentation isn't reliable." Johnny nodded once. "I expected that." The judge entered precisely at 9 o'clock. After routine matters concluded, Titan called its final expert witness, Dr. Alan Pierce, a respected engineering consultant with decades of experience in infrastructure technology. He explained sensor networks, machine learning, structural monitoring. His credentials impressed the jury. Then Titan's attorney asked the critical question. "Dr. Pierce, based on your review, Do you believe Mr. Simmons independently created Project Sentinel? And the courtroom became completely still. Dr. Pierce paused longer than anyone expected. Finally, he answered. I believe Mr. Simmons created a highly sophisticated system. Titan's attorney frowned. That wasn't my question. I know. Please answer it. Dr. Pierce folded his hands. I found no evidence that his work was copied. Silence. The attorney attempted to recover. But similarities exist. Dr. Pierce nodded. They do. Exactly. The same way airplanes share wings. The attorney looked confused. Engineering solutions often solve identical problems using similar principles, he continued. Similarity alone does not establish theft. Titan's attorney ended the examination earlier than planned. Rebecca stood for cross-examination. Dr. Pierce. Yes. You reviewed Mr. Simmons' notebooks. I did. All of them. Every page. Rebecca nodded. Did you discover chronological inconsistencies? No. Fabricated calculations? No. Modified laboratory records? No. Can engineering research of this complexity be created in only a few months? Dr. Pierce answered immediately. No. Rebecca smiled slightly. In your professional opinion, approximately how long would such development require? He looked briefly toward Johnny. Several years. No further questions. Rebecca returned to her seat. She whispered quietly. That was our witness wearing their badge. Johnny allowed himself the smallest smile. After the afternoon recess, the judge called counsel into chambers. Settlement discussions. Rebecca returned nearly 40 minutes later, carrying another envelope. She placed it beside Johnny. They've doubled the offer? Johnny opened the proposal. $120 million. Immediate payment. Joint licensing. Confidential agreement. No admission of wrongdoing. He closed the folder. No. Rebecca watched him carefully. You didn't hesitate. Johnny looked towards the courtroom doors. If I sign this, he tapped the agreement, the truth becomes negotiable. Rebecca nodded. I'll give them your answer. She stood. What should I tell them? Johnny replied quietly. Tell them I came here for a judgment, not a purchase. The verdict arrived 2 days later. The courtroom overflowed with journalists, engineers, university researchers, and industry executives. Word had spread far beyond Ohio. Project Sentinel was no longer simply a patent dispute. It had become a symbol. The jury entered. Every person stood except Johnny. The foreperson unfolded the verdict form. The judge asked, Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have. Johnny folded his hands. His heartbeat remained steady. Years earlier, he had learned something important during bridge inspections. Worry never changed. Measurements. Only results mattered. The foreperson began reading. On the claim of patent infringement, a brief pause, we find in favor of the defendant. Another pause. Johnny Simmons. Titan's attorneys remained expressionless. The foreperson continued. On the claim regarding intellectual property ownership, we find exclusive ownership belongs to Johnny Simmons. Rebecca slowly exhaled. The foreperson wasn't finished. On the counterclaim alleging bad faith litigation, the courtroom grew even quieter. We find in favor of Johnny Simmons. Charles Whitmore finally looked directly toward Johnny. For the first time since the trial began, the judge reviewed additional pages. He adjusted his glasses. The court awards legal costs. He continued reading. Punitive damages. Additional financial penalties. Permanent injunction against future ownership claims concerning Project Sentinel. Titan had lost completely. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. No celebration erupted. Johnny simply closed his eyes for one brief moment. Not because of victory, because years of uncertainty had finally ended. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed forward. Television cameras surrounded the courthouse steps. Microphones extended from every direction. Questions flew rapidly. Mr. Simmons, how does it feel? What will you do with the damages? Do you forgive Titan? Rebecca stepped toward the microphones. My client will answer one question. The crowd immediately quieted. Johnny positioned his wheelchair before the cameras. A reporter asked, "What does today's victory mean to you?" Johnny looked across the gathering. He answered slowly, "It means documentation matters." The reporter waited for more. Johnny continued, "People often think success comes from one extraordinary day." He shook his head. It doesn't. It comes from thousands of ordinary days recorded honestly. He paused. The notebooks didn't win this case. The truth inside them did. No dramatic speech followed. Johnny thanked the court, thanked his legal team, then quietly left. The interview lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet clips from those remarks spread across engineering organizations throughout the country. 3 days later, his phone began ringing constantly. Infrastructure firms, technology companies, transportation agencies, universities, investment groups. Every conversation sounded different. Every purpose sounded the same. They wanted access to Sentinel. Rebecca organized everything into categories: government, private industry, international inquiries, licensing, joint ventures, research partnerships. Johnny studied each proposal methodically. He rejected most within minutes, not because they lacked money, because they lacked purpose. One afternoon, Richard Hayes entered carrying another stack of folders. "You've become popular." Johnny looked toward the mountain of proposals. "I've become busy." Richard laughed. "Fair." He handed Johnny the first folder, State Transportation Consortium; the second, Canadian Bridge Authority; the third, Japanese Infrastructure Research Institute; the fourth, European Railway Safety Commission. Johnny raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected," Richard smiled. "No. The world has bridges." Johnny leaned back thoughtfully. "They also have aging bridges." "Exactly." Richard watched him organize the folders. "You're evaluating them like engineering reports." Johnny nodded. "I am." "What are you looking for?" Johnny answered without hesitation. "Who wants safer bridges?" And who only wants market share? Richard smiled. "Can you really tell?" Johnny looked down at the proposals. "Usually by page 3. Several weeks later, Johnny invited Ryan Cooper and Emily Foster to his office. Boxes still lined one wall from the lawsuit. Patent certificates hung neatly beside engineering awards. Ryan looked around. "This place feels different." Johnny smiled. "It has more chairs." Emily laughed. "I noticed." Johnny handed each of them a folder. Ryan opened his first. Employment Agreement, President of Field Engineering. Ryan stared. "You can't be serious." "I am." Emily looked inside hers. "Director of Human Performance Research." She looked confused. "I'm the physical therapist." Johnny nodded. "I know." She looked back at the offer. "What would I do?" Johnny answered. "I want technology designed for real people," he continued. "Recovery taught me engineers don't understand every problem." Ryan smiled. "So you're hiring people who do?" Johnny nodded. "Exactly." Neither accepted immediately. Neither declined. Both asked for 1 day to think. Johnny agreed. Some decisions deserved time. Late that evening, Johnny remained alone inside the office. The lawsuit was over. The offers continued arriving. The future looked larger than ever. He wheeled toward the window overlooking downtown Columbus. Streetlights reflected across the river. Traffic moved steadily over distant bridges. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the Franklin River Bridge where everything had changed. Johnny no longer thought about that day with anger. He thought about responsibility. Winning in court had protected his invention. Now he needed to prove it deserved protecting. He returned to his desk. At the top of a blank page, he wrote the name of a company that did not yet exist. Simmons Structural Technologies. Below it, he added one sentence: build systems that protect lives before structures fail. He placed the pen down. For the first time in years, the next chapter would not begin inside a courtroom. It would begin with a blueprint. The first step happened on a Tuesday morning. There was no audience, no applause, no cameras, exactly as Johnny Simmons had hoped. The rehabilitation gym looked almost empty when he arrived shortly after 7. Only one elderly patient practiced shoulder exercises in a distant corner. A therapist organized resistance bands near the equipment racks. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles across the polished floor. Emily Foster reviewed Johnny's progress notes without speaking. When she finished, she closed the folder. "You've reached every milestone." Johnny nodded. "I know." She looked directly at him. "Today's different." He understood immediately. No harness, no parallel bars, no safety rails, only a cane waiting quietly beside the therapy mat. Johnny stared at it for several seconds. For nearly 2 years, every movement had begun from a wheelchair. Today would begin somewhere else. Emily stepped closer. "I'm here." "I know. But I'm not carrying you." "I know." She smiled faintly. "I figured." Johnny transferred carefully into a standing position, using a nearby support rail. His legs trembled, but far less violently than they had months earlier. Emily handed him the cane. He wrapped his fingers around the handle. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Not because anyone had stopped moving, because Johnny heard only his own breathing. One controlled breath, then another. His right foot shifted forward, only 3 inches. He paused. His weight settled. Nothing collapsed. Nothing failed. Emily said nothing. The left foot followed. A second step. Uneven. Slow. Real. Johnny stopped again. His heartbeat accelerated. Not from fear, from concentration. Every nerve seemed awake. His muscles negotiated every movement independently, relearning conversations they had forgotten after the accident. A third step, then a fourth. The distance measured less than 6 feet. To anyone else it looked ordinary. To Johnny, it felt longer than every bridge he had ever inspected. Emily finally spoke. "How do you feel?" Johnny looked down at the floor beneath his feet. "Taller." Emily laughed softly. "I'll accept that." He took 2 more careful steps before stopping voluntarily. No dramatic celebration followed. Emily simply wrote today's date inside his rehabilitation chart. Patient achieved independent assisted ambulation. Johnny opened his own notebook beside hers. He wrote only one sentence. The body remembers when given enough time. Over the following weeks, walking gradually replaced standing as the primary goal. 10 feet, 20, 30. Each distance carefully recorded. Each improvement earned rather than celebrated. Emily noticed Johnny never informed anyone outside his closest circle. Not Richard, not Ryan, not Rebecca. Certainly not the media. One afternoon, she finally asked, "Why are you keeping this quiet?" Johnny adjusted the cane against the wall. "Because it isn't finished." "You've already done something remarkable." He nodded politely. "I've done something private." Emily considered that. "You don't want people watching." Johnny smiled. "I've spent 2 years learning not to perform recovery for other people." She understood. Recovery belonged to the person living it, not to spectators. Meanwhile, Simmons Structural Technologies officially opened its first office. The building occupied the renovated top floor of a former warehouse overlooking the Scioto River in Columbus. No extravagant lobby, No expensive artwork. Glass meeting rooms, engineering workstations, prototype laboratories. A modest conference room. Every dollar not required for operations went into research. Ryan Cooper accepted the position of President of Field Engineering. Emily accepted as Director of Human Performance Research after several weeks of consideration. Richard Hayes refused every executive title Johnny offered. "I'm too old for management." Johnny smiled. "So what do you want?" Richard answered immediately. "A desk." "You already have one." "Good. And coffee." Johnny laughed. "You'll always have coffee." Richard accepted the role of Senior Technical Advisor. The company remained intentionally small. 23 employees, every applicant interviewed personally by Johnny. He asked unusual questions, not about salaries, not about resumes. Instead, he asked, "Tell me about a mistake that taught you something." Some applicants became uncomfortable. Others answered honestly. Johnny hired the honest ones. 3 months after the lawsuit, the Federal Highway Administration announced a nationwide pilot program using Project Sentinel technology. 28 bridges across 7 states. Real-time structural monitoring. Independent federal evaluation. No commercial licensing yet. Only performance. Exactly as Johnny preferred. Government engineers visited the Columbus office almost weekly. Technical meetings lasted hours. Arguments filled whiteboards. Algorithms changed. Sensor designs improved. Johnny welcomed disagreement. Evidence decided every discussion, not titles. One afternoon, Ryan entered Johnny's office carrying several newspapers. "You've made the front page." Johnny barely looked up from a software model. "What happened?" Ryan placed the paper on the desk. "Engineer who defeated tech giant now leads National Bridge Safety Project." Johnny sighed quietly. "I was hoping they'd write about the bridges." Ryan smiled. "They wrote about you." Johnny folded the newspaper. "I can't reinforce steel with interviews." Ryan laughed. "No. But interviews help people understand why the steel matters." Johnny didn't argue. He simply returned to work. Across the city, Peyton's company hosted a quarterly leadership luncheon. Executives discussed supply contracts, expansion opportunities, and industry news. Halfway through dessert, someone projected recent business headlines onto a large screen. One article immediately caught everyone's attention. Federal Infrastructure Initiative expands Sentinel technology testing. A photograph accompanied the article. Johnny, standing beside engineers inside a laboratory, using only a cane. Peyton looked up instinctively. For several seconds, she forgot where she was. Someone across the table commented, "That's the engineer who beat Titan." Another executive nodded. "I heard his technology might become the national standard." Peyton remained silent. The photograph lingered on the screen. Johnny stood confidently. Not perfectly upright. Not completely free of assistance, but standing. The image contradicted every assumption she had carried for nearly 2 years. She quietly lowered her eyes. The presentation moved on to another topic. No one noticed she stopped eating. That evening, Peyton searched the internet. Engineering articles, court records, government announcements. She discovered far more than she expected. Project Sentinel, federal partnerships, patent victories, technical conferences, interviews. Everything had happened quietly while she believed Johnny's world had become permanently smaller. Instead, it had grown. She closed the laptop. No explanation could change the past. She understood that. Still, the realization remained difficult to ignore. Back in Columbus, construction crews completed Simmons Structural Technologies prototype laboratory. Johnny toured the facility with Ryan. Rows of vibration testing equipment filled one side of the building. Environmental chambers occupied another. Bridge components rested beneath overhead cranes. Ryan looked around proudly. "Not bad," Johnny nodded. "It's enough." Ryan laughed. "You've just built one of the most advanced private infrastructure labs in the Midwest." Johnny smiled. We still need better lighting. Ryan shook his head. You never change. I hope not. Near the laboratory entrance, workers finished installing a bronze plaque. Ryan read it aloud. Simmons Structural Technologies, engineering confidence through evidence. He looked toward Johnny. You really chose that. Johnny nodded. Confidence should come after proof. Several days later, the first federal performance report arrived. 28 monitored bridges, thousands of operational hours, 0 critical system failures. 3 previously undetected maintenance issues identified early, millions of dollars in potential repair costs avoided. Most importantly, no safety incidents. Richard Hayes placed the report on Johnny's desk. I've waited years to read this. Johnny reviewed every page carefully. No dramatic reactions, only quiet satisfaction. Richard watched him. That's all? Johnny looked up. What? I expected something. Johnny closed the report. I already celebrated. When? The day the first bridge warned us before failing. Richard smiled. I should have known. Late that afternoon, Emily entered the office carrying rehabilitation discharge paperwork. She placed it gently on Johnny's desk. I think this belongs to you. Johnny opened the folder. Officially discharged from routine physical rehabilitation. Recommended independent maintenance program. He stared at the final page longer than expected. Emily sat across from him. You okay? Johnny nodded slowly. I wasn't expecting this to feel... He searched for the right word. Final... Emily smiled. You're not finished recovering. No. But you're finished depending on recovery. Johnny understood. There was a difference. She stood to leave. One step from the door, she stopped. I almost forgot. Johnny looked up. What? Emily smiled warmly. I've never seen you use the wheelchair all day. Johnny glanced toward the corner of the office. The chair rested there exactly where he had left it that morning, unused, for the first time since the accident. He quietly stood, picked up his cane, and walked across the room under his own strength. Not perfectly, not quickly, but independently. He stopped beside the window overlooking the city. Cars crossed distant bridges beneath the setting sun. Somewhere among thousands of commuters, nobody knew the engineer watching over those structures had once been told he might never stand again. Johnny rested one hand lightly on the window. The wheelchair remained behind him. For the first time, it no longer felt like part of his future, only part of his history. By early autumn, Project Sentinel had become impossible for the engineering community to ignore. Federal pilot programs expanded from 28 bridges to 63. State transportation departments requested demonstrations almost weekly. Universities invited Johnny Simmons to lecture about structural monitoring, artificial intelligence, and engineering ethics. He accepted very few invitations. Ryan Cooper eventually noticed the pattern. You've declined almost every conference. Johnny looked up from a bridge simulation running across 3 monitors. I accepted 2, Ryan laughed. Out of 37. Johnny shrugged. I have work. Ryan leaned against the office doorway. People want to hear your story. Johnny returned his attention to the monitor. I'd rather they hear the bridge. Ryan smiled. You always say things like that. Johnny finally looked at him. Because they're true. Ryan left without arguing. He understood that Johnny had never been interested in becoming famous. Recognition was simply another responsibility to manage carefully. One Monday morning, Rebecca Collins arrived carrying a newspaper and a tablet. She placed both on Johnny's desk. You should see this. Johnny glanced at the headline. Tech giant faces shareholder questions after Sentinel lawsuit. Another article described ongoing federal reviews of Titan Infrastructure Solutions' legal practices. Rebecca folded her arms. The lawsuit didn't end with the verdict. Johnny read quietly. It rarely does. Shareholders questioned why Titan had pursued litigation instead of partnership. Several industry analysts estimated the failed lawsuit had cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. No one accused Charles Whitmore of breaking the law. Instead, investors questioned his judgment. Johnny placed the newspaper aside. "I don't enjoy reading this." Rebecca looked surprised. "Really?" He nodded. "They employ thousands of engineers." She understood. Poor executive decisions often hurt employees who never participated in making them. Rebecca sat down. "There's something else." She opened the tablet. "The Senate Committee on Transportation wants testimony during next month's infrastructure hearings." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "They want me?" "They want someone who actually built the technology." Johnny looked thoughtful. "When?" 2 weeks. He closed the tablet. "I'll go." Rebecca smiled. "I had a feeling." Washington, D.C. The hearing room inside the Capitol looked less dramatic than television suggested. Long tables, microphones, stacks of reports, government officials, transportation experts, academic researchers. Johnny arrived carrying only one leather portfolio. No prepared speech, only data. Committee members spent hours discussing budgets, regulations, and aging infrastructure. Finally, the chairman recognized Johnny. "Mr. Simmons." Johnny adjusted the microphone. "Good morning." "You've heard today's testimony." "I have." "What would you like this committee to understand?" Johnny opened his portfolio. Inside rested only 3 photographs. The Franklin River Bridge before collapse, the same bridge afterward, a monitored bridge protected by Sentinel. He placed them side by side. "I'd like to begin here." The committee members leaned forward. Johnny continued. "Every structure fails twice." Several senators exchanged curious looks. "The first failure happens when damage begins." He pointed toward the photographs. "The second happens when people finally notice." Silence settled across the chamber. Johnny continued calmly. "Engineering should reduce the time between those moments." One senator asked, "Can technology eliminate every disaster?" Johnny shook his head. "No." "What can it do?" "It can eliminate unnecessary surprises." For nearly an hour he answered questions. Maintenance costs, artificial intelligence, data privacy, federal standards. He never exaggerated, never promised perfection, only measurable improvement. When the hearing ended, the committee chairman approached privately. "You speak differently than most witnesses." Johnny smiled politely. "I'm not a politician." "No." The chairman laughed. "You're definitely not." Television coverage aired portions of the hearing that evening. Several clips spread rapidly across social media. One sentence appeared repeatedly. Engineering should reduce the time between failure and discovery. Millions watched. Johnny never did. He spent the evening reviewing software updates with Ryan. Across Columbus, Peyton returned home after work. Her fiancé Mason Grant already waited inside the apartment. Mason worked as a successful commercial real estate developer. Confident, well-connected, practical. He noticed the television coverage immediately. "That's your ex-husband." Peyton looked toward the screen. Johnny answered questions before the Senate committee with the same quiet confidence she remembered from years earlier. Nothing theatrical, nothing emotional, only facts. Mason shook his head. "I've never seen an engineer become national news." Peyton remained silent. The interview ended. Another story replaced it. Mason looked toward her. "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine." He accepted the answer without asking again. After he left the room to answer a phone call, Peyton remained staring at the blank television. For the first time, she realized something that unsettled her. Johnny had not changed. The circumstances around him had. His patience, his discipline, his quiet way of speaking. They were all exactly the same. She wondered whether she had mistaken temporary hardship for permanent limitation. The thought lingered long after the television switched off. Several days later, Simmons Structural Technologies hosted its first open engineering symposium. Nearly 300 engineers attended. University students, bridge inspectors, transportation officials, private contractors. Johnny insisted the event remain educational rather than promotional. No product sales, no investor presentations, only technical discussions. Richard Hayes opened the symposium. I've spent 50 years teaching engineering. He smiled toward the audience. Today I'm here to keep learning. The audience laughed warmly. Ryan demonstrated new sensor hardware. Emily presented research connecting rehabilitation biomechanics with ergonomic engineering design. Johnny closed the symposium with a short presentation. Not about Sentinel, about responsibility. He displayed photographs of famous bridge failures throughout American history, then photographs of ordinary bridges carrying ordinary families. The public never notices good engineering, he paused. That's the goal? Several students took notes. Johnny continued. If your bridge becomes famous, he smiled faintly. Something probably went wrong. Laughter spread across the auditorium. Then silence returned. Recognition belongs to failure. Our responsibility belongs to prevention. When the presentation ended, the audience stood in applause. Johnny acknowledged them with a simple nod before stepping away from the stage. He never lingered for admiration. Later that afternoon, a young engineering student approached him. She looked nervous. My name is Sarah. Johnny smiled. Nice to meet you. I almost changed majors after failing structural analysis. Johnny listened quietly. She continued. Then I read about your accident. Johnny remained silent. And your lawsuit. Another pause. I realized difficult years don't necessarily become failed lives. Johnny looked toward the crowded auditorium. What year are you? Second. He nodded. Good. She looked confused. Good. You still have plenty of mistakes left. She laughed. So do you. Johnny smiled. I hope so. She thanked him before leaving. Ryan walked over moments later. You realize she'll remember that conversation forever. Johnny looked surprised. I told her she'll make mistakes. Ryan grinned. Exactly. 1 month later, the American Society of Civil Engineers released its annual Innovation Awards. Project Sentinel received the highest technical recognition. The announcement generated national media coverage. Johnny accepted the award through a recorded message instead of attending in person. His entire speech lasted less than 2 minutes. He thanked his team, his mentors, bridge inspectors across the country, maintenance crews, researchers. Then he ended with one sentence. The safest bridge is usually the one nobody talks about. The audience applauded. Johnny returned to work before the ceremony even concluded. That same evening, Charles Whitmore sat alone inside his Chicago office. Titan stock continued recovering slowly after months of instability. The lawsuit remained a painful memory. His assistant entered quietly. Sir. Yes. The engineering award ceremony just ended. Charles nodded. I know. She hesitated. Would you like me to arrange another meeting with Mr. Simmons? Charles looked through the window at the city below. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he answered. No. His assistant waited. Charles spoke quietly. Some opportunities disappear because of competition. Another pause. Others disappear because of pride. After she left, he remained standing beside the window. For the first time in many years, he admitted something to himself that he had refused to acknowledge throughout the lawsuit. Johnny Simmons had never been his enemy. His own arrogance had been. Hundreds of miles away, Johnny locked the office door before heading home. He walked slowly toward his car with only a cane. The parking lot had already emptied. The evening air felt cool. Streetlights reflected across the quiet pavement. No reporters waited. No cameras. No applause. Exactly the way he preferred. Tomorrow morning he would return before sunrise. There were still thousands of bridges waiting to be made safer. And for Johnny Simmons, meaningful work had always been the greatest reward of all. 6 months after the Senate hearing, an official envelope arrived from Washington, D.C. Johnny Simmons almost left it unopened until the end of the day. Ryan Cooper noticed the seal while walking into the office. "That doesn't look like another licensing request." Johnny glanced at it. "It probably isn't." Richard Hayes happened to be visiting that afternoon. He picked up the envelope and smiled. "Only one way to find out." Johnny finally opened it. Inside rested a formal invitation from the United States Department of Transportation. The National Infrastructure Innovation Awards, Washington, D.C. Johnny Simmons had been selected to receive the nation's highest civilian recognition for engineering innovation in transportation safety. The ceremony would be attended by federal officials, state transportation leaders, university presidents, and representatives from major infrastructure companies. Ryan read the letter twice. "Johnny." He looked up. "This is huge." Johnny quietly folded the invitation. "It's an award ceremony." Richard laughed. "No. It's history." Emily Foster entered moments later after finishing a meeting downstairs. Ryan handed her the letter. She smiled immediately. "You have to go." Johnny looked thoughtful. "I wasn't planning to." 3 people answered at once. "Yes, you are." The room filled with laughter. Preparations began several weeks later. Johnny's concern had nothing to do with speeches. It involved walking. Although he now moved independently, with only occasional use of a cane, long distance still exhausted him. Emily reviewed the ceremony schedule. "How far is the stage?" "About 40 feet. She looked at Johnny. "You can do 40 feet. "I know." He hesitated. "I'd rather not use the cane." Emily understood immediately. "Because," Johnny looked toward the window, "I don't want people watching how I walk." She sat beside him. "They're already watching." He nodded. "I know." She smiled gently. "But they're coming to honor an engineer." "Not a perfect stride." Johnny remained silent. Emily continued. "Walk however your body allows. The achievement isn't that you recovered. It's that you never stopped building." Those words remained with him long after she left the office. Across Columbus, Peyton received another unexpected invitation. As regional operations director for her company, she had been invited to attend the same National Transportation Awards through an industry partnership. She accepted weeks earlier without reading the complete guest list. Only while reviewing the final program did she notice one name: Johnny Simmons, recipient, National Infrastructure Innovation Award. She stared at the printed schedule. The ceremony suddenly felt far more personal than professional. Mason Grant looked over her shoulder. "That's the same engineer from television." Peyton nodded quietly. "My ex-husband." Mason looked surprised. "I forgot he was receiving an award." She didn't answer. Instead, she carefully folded the program and placed it inside her briefcase. Washington, D.C. The ballroom inside the historic conference center overlooked the National Mall. Large windows filled the room with afternoon light. American flags stood behind the stage. Rows of round tables stretched across the hall. Transportation officials greeted one another. University researchers discussed new projects. Journalists quietly arranged camera equipment along the back wall. Johnny arrived with Richard, Ryan, Emily, and Rebecca. No entourage, no security. Only the people who had remained beside him throughout the hardest years. A ceremony coordinator greeted them. "Mr. Simmons." She smiled warmly. "We're honored to have you." Johnny thanked her politely. She reviewed the evening schedule. "You'll be seated in the front row." When your name is announced, you'll approach the stage from the center aisle. Johnny nodded. Simple enough. As guests continued arriving, Peyton entered from the opposite side of the ballroom with Mason. She scanned the room casually, then stopped. Johnny stood near the front, speaking quietly with Richard Hayes. He wore a dark navy suit, no wheelchair, no visible cane. Only a slight stiffness remained in his posture if someone looked carefully enough. Peyton felt her breath catch. For nearly 2 years, the last image she had carried was of Johnny leaving the rehabilitation center in a wheelchair. Now he stood naturally among engineers and government officials. Mason noticed her expression. "You know him well," she answered honestly. "I used to." The ceremony began precisely at 6. Awards were presented for bridge restoration. Emergency response, research, public service. Each recipient spoke briefly. Johnny listened attentively from the front row. He applauded every winner, never looking toward the audience. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped back to the podium. "Our final recognition tonight honors innovation that has already begun changing how America protects its infrastructure." Large screens displayed photographs, the Franklin River Bridge collapse, engineering diagrams, federal testing, bridge monitoring systems, then photographs of Project Sentinel, the narrator continued. "His work has helped identify structural risks before disaster occurs. His dedication reminds us that engineering serves people first. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Johnny Simmons." The ballroom erupted in applause. Johnny took one slow breath. Emily caught his eye from across the room. She smiled once. No words. Only encouragement. Johnny stood, then began walking toward the stage. One step, then another. Steady, measured, independent. The room remained standing in applause. Many believed they were honoring an engineer. Very few understood they were also witnessing a victory over 2 years of rehabilitation. Halfway down the aisle, Peyton could no longer look away. She watched every careful step, every quiet movement. Not dramatic, not perfect, real. She remembered hospital rooms, wheelchairs, doctors explaining permanent injuries, divorce papers. Now the same man crossed the ballroom under his own strength. No announcement mentioned his recovery. No one needed to. The evidence walked beside him. Johnny reached the stage. He accepted the medal from the Secretary of Transportation. They shook hands. Photographers captured the moment. The audience applauded again. The secretary leaned toward the microphone. "Mr. Simmons has requested only a few minutes." Johnny stepped forward. He looked across hundreds of faces. Government officials, students, engineers, business leaders. Then, somewhere near the middle of the ballroom, he noticed Peyton for only a fraction of a second. He recognized her. His expression never changed. He looked away. Not from anger, simply because tonight wasn't about the past. He began speaking. "When I started working on Project Sentinel, my goal wasn't to invent something famous. It was to prevent families from receiving terrible phone calls." Silence filled the ballroom. Johnny continued. "Engineering often succeeds quietly. If a bridge stands safely for 50 years, nobody celebrates. They simply drive home." A few people smiled. He looked toward the medal in his hand. "This award belongs to many people. Teachers, inspectors, maintenance crews, researchers, my colleagues, my friends." He paused briefly. "And to everyone who believed evidence matters more than assumptions." The final sentence settled deeply over the room. Johnny smiled gently. "Thank you. Nothing more. No dramatic ending." The audience rose once again in a standing ovation. After the ceremony concluded, guests gathered for a reception. Federal officials congratulated Johnny. University presidents requested future partnerships. Students asked for photographs. He spoke with each person patiently. Across the ballroom, Peyton remained motionless. She watched from a distance. Johnny laughed with Ryan. Richard proudly introduced him to longtime colleagues. Emily adjusted his medal before teasing him about standing too long. The scene looked natural, comfortable, complete. Peyton realized something she had avoided admitting for years. Johnny had not been waiting for the people who walked away. He had continued building a life with the people who stayed. Mason quietly approached. "Oh, you don't have to go say hello." She looked toward Johnny again. "I know." And Peyton lowered her eyes briefly. "I don't think tonight belongs to me." Mason nodded. For once, no further explanation was necessary. Across the room, Johnny continued speaking with young engineering students who surrounded him with questions about bridge design. He never once searched the crowd. He never looked for validation. He never wondered who might be watching. The recognition he had earned no longer depended on any single person's opinion. As the evening ended, Johnny walked out of the ballroom beneath the lights of Washington, D.C. The medal rested quietly inside its presentation case. He carried it the same way he carried every success, with gratitude, without pride. And behind him, unnoticed by almost everyone else, Peyton watched the ballroom doors close finally. Understanding that the man she had once believed was broken had simply been rebuilding himself all along. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after the ceremony in Washington. It was handwritten, not typed, not delivered through an attorney. Only a plain white envelope addressed to Johnny Simmons. Inside rested a single card. "Would you be willing to meet for coffee? No expectations. No arguments, just one conversation." Peyton Johnny read the note twice before placing it back inside the envelope. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to reviewing inspection data from a bridge outside Cleveland. Ryan Cooper noticed the unopened envelope still resting on the desk the following morning. "You've been staring at that for 2 days." Johnny smiled faintly. "I've been ignoring it." Ryan sat across from him. "You don't have to answer." "I know. Are you going to—" Johnny remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. "I've been asking myself why." "Why meet—" Ryan nodded. "And—" Johnny leaned back in his chair. "Because unfinished conversations sometimes remain heavier than finished ones." Ryan smiled. "That sounds like something Richard would say." Johnny laughed. "It probably does." Richard Hayes listened carefully after Johnny showed him the note. He never interrupted. When Johnny finished, Richard folded the card and handed it back. "What do you want?" Johnny answered honestly. "I don't know." Richard nodded. "Good." Johnny looked confused. "Good. If you were meeting because you wanted revenge—" Richard shrugged. "I'd tell you not to go." Johnny smiled slightly. "I don't." "If you're meeting because you hope to rebuild your marriage," Richard continued, "I'd ask you to think carefully." Johnny shook his head. "No." Richard studied him for a moment. "Then why go—" Johnny looked through the office window toward the river. "I think I want to discover whether the past still controls me." Richard smiled warmly. "Now that's a worthwhile reason." Johnny replied with only one sentence. "Friday, 10 o'clock. The small coffee shop near Franklin Park. Nothing else." Friday morning arrived cool and clear. Johnny reached the cafe 15 minutes early. Old habits remained. Preparation, punctuality, quiet observation. He chose a table near the window. When Peyton entered exactly at 10, she paused for a brief moment after seeing him. He stood as she approached. Not perfectly, a slight stiffness remained in his left leg. But he stood. "Hello, Peyton." "Hello, Johnny." Neither reached for a handshake. Neither attempted a hug. The years between them remained visible. They sat. For several seconds, neither spoke. The waitress arrived first. Coffee, tea, simple orders. Then silence returned. Finally, Peyton spoke. "Congratulations." Johnny nodded politely. "Thank you." "I watched the ceremony." "I know." She looked surprised. "You knew—" "I saw you." Another brief silence settled over the table. Peyton looked down at her cup. You looked healthy. Johnny smiled gently. Health is relative. She nodded. I suppose it is. The conversation moved slowly. Neither rushed, neither accused. Peyton finally looked directly at him. I owe you an apology. Johnny listened. I left when your life became harder. She paused. I convinced myself I was being practical. Another pause. I wasn't. Johnny remained silent. I was afraid. The words hung quietly between them. Johnny answered only after several moments. I believed that. Peyton looked surprised. You did? I knew you were afraid. She lowered her eyes. I thought you hated me. Johnny looked out the window before answering. Hate requires energy. I didn't have much left. His voice remained calm. I was trying to learn how to live again. Peyton slowly nodded. I understand that now. Johnny thought carefully before speaking again. No. He smiled sadly. I don't think anyone can completely understand another person's rehabilitation. She accepted the answer without argument. After another few minutes, Peyton asked the question she had carried for months. When did you start walking? Johnny smiled. Long before Washington. I know. I meant... She hesitated. I never knew. Johnny looked down at his coffee. I didn't tell many people. Why? Because recovery wasn't something I wanted to announce. He looked back at her. I wanted to experience it. Peyton quietly wiped one eye. I saw you cross that stage. Johnny nodded. It took a while. I cried. Johnny didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, I'm glad you were there. She looked surprised. You are... I think everyone deserves to witness what perseverance looks like. She smiled sadly. I didn't deserve that. Johnny answered gently. That's not my decision to make. The conversation shifted away from the past. They spoke about Columbus, about mutual friends, about Richard, about Ryan, about Emily, about ordinary things. For the first time in years, the memories no longer carried sharp edges. Eventually, Peyton placed both hands around her coffee cup. There's something else. Johnny waited. I've spent months wondering. She stopped. Johnny remained patient. If things had happened differently. Another pause. Could we ever have found our way back? Johnny looked outside again. Leaves drifted gently through the autumn air. People walked along the sidewalk without noticing the conversation unfolding inside. He answered carefully. I've asked myself that too. Peyton waited. Johnny continued. I think we loved different versions of each other. She listened quietly. The man you married believed hard work could solve almost anything. He smiled faintly. The man sitting here learned that some losses simply become part of life. Peyton slowly nodded. And me, Johnny answered honestly. I don't know who you've become. She accepted that answer. It took losing everything to discover who I was. Johnny looked at her kindly. Sometimes that's how people grow. She smiled sadly. We just didn't grow together. No, Johnny agreed softly. We didn't. An hour passed, almost unnoticed. Neither person raised their voice. Neither defended old decisions. The past remained unchanged. Neither attempted to rewrite it. When the waitress refilled their cups one final time, Peyton quietly reached into her purse. She removed a small envelope. I've carried this for years. Johnny looked at it. What is it? The spare house key. He smiled. You could have thrown it away. I know. She placed it on the table. I think today is the right day. Johnny looked at the old brass key. Such an ordinary object. Once it had represented an entire shared life. Now it represented closure. He picked it up gently. Not because he needed it, because he understood what returning it meant. Thank you. Outside the cafe, they stood together beneath a line of maple trees. Cars passed quietly along the street. The morning had become brighter. Peyton looked at him. I don't expect forgiveness. Johnny answered immediately. I already forgave you. She stared at him. You did a long time ago. Why? Johnny smiled. Because carrying resentment was heavier than learning to walk. She covered her mouth with one hand. Tears finally appeared. I'm sorry. I know. I truly am. I know. She took one slow breath. I hope your future is everything you built it to be. Johnny nodded. I hope yours brings you peace. No promises followed. No dramatic reconciliation. No unexpected romance. Only two people who had once shared a life, acknowledging that the road ahead no longer belonged to both of them. Peyton extended her hand. Johnny looked at it briefly, then shook it warmly. Not formally, not awkwardly, simply with respect. They released their hands. Peyton walked toward her car without looking back. Johnny watched her leave. He expected to feel sadness. Instead, he felt something else. Lightness. The conversation had not restored the past. It had released it. Johnny stood quietly beneath the autumn trees for another minute. His mind wandered briefly through hospital rooms, courtrooms, rehabilitation gyms, engineering laboratories, award stages. Every chapter had carried both pain and purpose. He realized something that had taken years to understand. Forgiveness was not permission, it was freedom. He turned and began walking toward his own car. His pace remained measured. His left leg still carried the slightest reminder of the accident. It probably always would. Johnny no longer wished for perfect recovery. He had already received something greater, a life no longer defined by what had been taken away, but by everything he had chosen to build afterward. Nearly 1 year later, the Franklin River Bridge site looked nothing like the place where Johnny Simmons' life had changed forever. The twisted steel had long been removed. Fresh concrete supports rose from the riverbanks. New structural members stretched across the water beneath massive construction cranes. Most importantly, every critical component carried Project Sentinel sensors before the bridge even opened. Johnny visited only once during construction. He stood quietly beside the project superintendent as crews completed final inspections. The superintendent smiled. I suppose this one makes you nervous. Johnny looked toward the river. No. It reminds me why details matter. The superintendent nodded. I've never seen a bridge inspected this thoroughly. Johnny smiled. I hope every bridge eventually is. Simmons' structural technologies had grown carefully, not rapidly, carefully. Johnny refused several acquisition offers from multinational corporations. He rejected proposals that would have made him extraordinarily wealthy. Ryan never questioned those decisions anymore. He understood the pattern. Growth always followed purpose, never the other way around. The company now employed nearly 100 engineers, software developers, inspectors, and researchers. Every new employee attended the same orientation. Johnny personally spoke during the final session. His presentation never changed. He held up one of his original engineering notebooks. The cover remained worn after years of use. This company exists because someone wrote things down. The room usually laughed. Johnny always smiled. I'm serious. He opened the notebook carefully. Mistakes documented become lessons. Mistakes forgotten and become repeated. He closed the notebook. We don't guess. We measure. We don't assume. We verify. We don't chase headlines. We protect people who will never know our names. The room always became quiet after those words. Johnny preferred it that way. Emily Foster expanded the Human Performance Research Division beyond rehabilitation. Her team studied how engineers interacted with inspection equipment in difficult environments: bridge climbers, tunnel inspectors, emergency responders, fatigue, balance, safety. Johnny frequently attended the meetings. He rarely spoke first. Instead, he listened. Emily noticed the change one afternoon. "You've become a better leader." Johnny looked surprised. "I hope so." She smiled. "You used to solve every problem yourself. And now, you ask better questions." Johnny considered that. Perhaps recovery had taught him something engineering alone never could. Some progress depended on trusting other people. Richard Hayes officially retired for the third time. Nobody believed it. During the farewell lunch, Ryan raised a coffee cup. "Richard has retired more often than anyone I've ever met." Laughter filled the conference room. Richard smiled. "I simply keep failing." Johnny handed him a framed photograph. Not of an award ceremony, not of Washington, not of the courtroom. Instead, it showed an old coffee-stained napkin, the first rough sketch of Project Sentinel. Beneath the photograph, a small engraved plaque read, "You believed impossible ideas deserved conversation. Thank you for listening." Richard remained silent for several moments. Finally, he looked toward Johnny. "I didn't build this." Johnny smiled warmly. "No. But you kept me building it." Richard carefully placed one hand on Johnny's shoulder. Neither man said anything more. They didn't need to. One spring afternoon, Ryan entered Johnny's office, carrying an unusual request. "A high school engineering club wants to visit." Johnny smiled. "How many students?" 30. "When?" "Tomorrow." Johnny looked around his office. "Good." Ryan laughed. "You didn't ask anything else." "What else matters?" "The schedule." "We'll make time." The following afternoon, 30 teenagers walked through the laboratories wearing oversized safety glasses. They asked endless questions: artificial intelligence, sensors, bridge failures, patents, business. One student finally raised a hand. "Mr. Simmons." "Yes." "What was the most important invention you ever created?" Several adults expected him to answer Project Sentinel. Johnny thought for only a moment. "My daily habit." The students looked confused. He smiled. "I wrote something every day." "Observations." "Questions." "Failures." "Progress." He held up another notebook. "This habit eventually became everything else." The students scribbled notes. One young boy asked, "So success isn't one big idea?" Johnny shook his head. "No. It's thousands of small, honest ones." Late that summer, the rebuilt Franklin River Bridge officially opened. The governor attended. Federal transportation officials attended. Community members gathered along both sides of the river. Johnny accepted the invitation only after learning he would not be required to give a speech. Instead, organizers asked him to join several construction workers and engineers for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, exactly where he preferred to stand, beside the people who actually built the bridge. As the ribbon fell, traffic slowly crossed the bridge for the first time. Families waved from passing cars. Children looked through the windows excitedly. Most drivers never noticed the hundreds of sensors quietly protecting the structure beneath them. Johnny smiled. That was the point. The governor approached. "You should say something." Johnny looked toward the steady traffic. "I think the bridge already did." That evening, Johnny returned home carrying a small souvenir from the ceremony. Not the commemorative plaque, not the official photographs. Only a single construction bolt removed during final installation. He placed it beside the first engineering notebook inside a glass display case. One represented where the journey began, The other represented why it mattered. Months later, Johnny received another invitation. This one came from Ohio State University's College of Engineering. Honorary doctorate, commencement speaker. Ryan laughed when Johnny sighed after reading it. "You're thinking about declining?" Johnny nodded. "I am." Emily crossed her arms. "You're not allowed." Richard laughed. "For once, I agree with Emily." Rebecca added quietly, "Thousands of students are about to begin careers. They should hear from someone who understands both success and failure." Johnny looked around the room. Every person there had walked beside him through different chapters of his life. He smiled. "All right. I'll do it." Graduation day arrived beneath clear blue skies. Thousands of graduates filled the stadium. Families cheered from the stands. Faculty members lined the stage. Johnny waited behind the curtain holding only a few handwritten pages. Not because he needed them, because he respected preparation. The university president introduced him. Honorary Doctor of Engineering, National Infrastructure Innovator, Founder, Research Leader. The applause continued for nearly a minute. Johnny walked toward the podium. Steady, confident, independent. He looked across thousands of young engineers preparing to begin their own journeys. His speech remained simple. "You've spent years learning equations." Soft laughter spread across the audience. "They matter," he smiled, "but eventually you'll discover something even more important." He held up one worn notebook. "Character is documented exactly the same way engineering is. One decision, one day, one page at a time." The graduates listened quietly. He continued. "You will fail. You will be disappointed. You will lose opportunities." He paused. "None of those moments will define you. What you build afterward will." The audience remained completely silent. Johnny looked across the sea of future engineers. "I once believed bridges connected places." He smiled gently. "Now I believe they connect people who may never meet. Our responsibility is to make sure those people arrive home." He closed the notebook. "Congratulations." The stadium erupted into applause. As graduates threw their caps into the air, Johnny stepped away from the podium. He had spoken for less than 10 minutes. He hoped they would remember only one sentence. Build carefully, live honestly, keep records. Outside the stadium, families embraced. Photographs filled the campus. Laughter echoed beneath the summer sky. Johnny quietly walked toward his car. Not because he wished to leave unnoticed, but because he had already learned the lesson that mattered most. A meaningful life was never measured by how long people applauded. It was measured by what remained standing after the applause ended. 5 years later, on a quiet spring morning, the headquarters of Simmons Structural Technologies looked almost peaceful. The company had grown far beyond its original warehouse office. Several connected research buildings overlooked the Scioto River. Engineers crossed glass walkways carrying laptops and rolled blueprints. Research teams tested next-generation monitoring systems inside advanced laboratories. The parking lot filled before sunrise, not because employees were expected to arrive early, because they wanted to. The culture Johnny Simmons had built spread through the company more effectively than any policy manual ever could. Evidence, humility, preparation, responsibility. Those principles appeared in meeting rooms, laboratories, and field offices across the country. Johnny still arrived before most people. Some habits never changed. He carried the same leather notebook he had used for years. Its pages were newer. The routine was identical. Observe, record, improve, repeat. Ryan Cooper knocked once before entering Johnny's office. "You've got visitors." Johnny smiled. "Students again." Ryan nodded. 40 this time." Johnny laughed quietly. "I suppose that's becoming a tradition?" "It already has." Every spring, engineering students from different universities toured the headquarters. No marketing presentations. No recruiting speeches, only honest conversations about engineering. Johnny preferred those mornings more than award ceremonies. Students asked questions adults often forgot to ask. Why, how, what, if curiosity remained the strongest engineering tool he had ever encountered. The tour ended inside the original laboratory. Johnny intentionally preserved one corner exactly as it had looked during the company's earliest days. The first workbench, the first sensor prototype, the first whiteboard, the first notebook. One student looked surprised. "You kept all of this?" Johnny nodded. "I needed reminders of success." He smiled. "No. Of beginnings?" The students gathered closer. Johnny picked up the original notebook. Its edges had become soft from years of use. "The most valuable thing in this room isn't technology." A student looked around. "The notebook." Johnny nodded. "Because ideas disappear. Written ideas improve." The students photographed almost everything. Very few photographed Johnny. He appreciated that. After the tour ended, Johnny remained alone in the laboratory. He opened the notebook to its very first page. The handwriting looked younger, less confident, more hurried. One sentence stood alone near the top. "There has to be a better way." Johnny smiled. That single sentence had eventually protected thousands of bridges and millions of travelers. He gently closed the notebook. Sometimes enormous futures began with ordinary questions. Across the country, Project Sentinel had become the national standard for critical bridge monitoring. International partnerships expanded throughout Europe, Japan, Canada, and Australia. Entire engineering textbooks referenced the system. Universities studied its development process, not because of the software alone, because of the documentation. Case studies repeatedly highlighted the lawsuit, the notebooks, the evidence, the discipline behind every decision. Johnny often found that quietly amusing. The habit everyone once considered obsessive had eventually become one of the project's greatest strengths. Richard Hayes celebrated his 80th birthday surrounded by former students. Johnny attended carrying only one gift, a brand new leather notebook. Richard laughed immediately. "You've learned nothing." Johnny smiled. "I learned from the best." Richard accepted the notebook carefully. "I probably don't have enough years left to fill this," Johnny answered softly. "Then write things worth remembering." Richard looked at him proudly. "You've become a better teacher than I ever was." Johnny shook his head. "I had better examples." Emily Foster now directed an internationally recognized research institute focused on engineering and human performance. She continued collaborating with Simmons Structural Technologies while leading independent research programs. One afternoon, she visited Johnny after completing a lecture nearby. She noticed something immediately. "The cane." Johnny looked toward the corner of the office. It leaned quietly beside the bookshelf, unused. "You still keep it?" He nodded. "I probably always will." "As a reminder," Johnny smiled. "As a thank you." Emily understood. Recovery should never be forgotten, not because of pain, because of gratitude. Life continued moving forward. Ryan eventually married and started a family. Rebecca Collins became one of the country's leading intellectual property attorneys. Richard finally reduced his consulting hours. Emily expanded her research internationally. Each person followed a different path, yet they remained connected by one difficult chapter that had changed all of them. Every year they gathered for dinner on the anniversary of the company's founding. Not the lawsuit, not the award, not the accident, the company, because they believed creation deserved more celebration than survival. One autumn afternoon, Johnny drove alone to the Franklin River Bridge. Traffic moved steadily across its surface. Parents drove children home from school. Delivery trucks crossed without slowing. Cyclists used the protected lane. Joggers crossed the pedestrian walkway overlooking the river. Nobody looked down toward the hidden monitoring systems inside the structure. Nobody wondered whether the bridge remained safe. That quiet confidence represented the greatest compliment an engineer could receive. Johnny walked slowly onto the pedestrian overlook. The injury still announced itself during colder weather. A slight stiffness remained. He no longer fought it. It had become another part of his history. He rested one hand lightly against the railing. The river flowed beneath him exactly as it had years before. The water had continued moving regardless of triumph or tragedy. Life seemed to work that way too. Johnny closed his eyes briefly. Not to remember the collapse. To appreciate the bridge that stood before him now. His phone vibrated softly. A message from Ryan. "Dinner tonight, Richard insists on paying." Johnny smiled. He typed one word. "Impossible." Seconds later, another message arrived. "He says that's never stopped him before." Johnny laughed aloud. Some things truly never changed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked once more across the bridge. Families crossed safely, students crossed safely, workers crossed safely, thousands of ordinary lives continued uninterrupted, exactly as they should. Johnny turned and walked back toward his car. Not hurried, not delayed, simply steady. Years earlier, after the accident, doctors had warned that his future would become smaller. Instead, his world had expanded in ways he never imagined. Not because he became wealthy, not because he became famous, not because he won awards. Those things mattered far less than people believed. His life became larger because suffering had taught him patience. Failure had taught him discipline. Recovery had taught him gratitude. Justice had taught him integrity. And forgiveness had taught him freedom. He had once measured success by projects completed. Now he measured it differently. Bridges that remained standing, young engineers who asked thoughtful questions, friends who stayed, communities that traveled safely without ever knowing his name. Those were accomplishments worth protecting. As the sun began lowering across the Ohio sky, Johnny started the engine and drove home. The rebuilt bridge gradually disappeared in the rearview mirror. Ahead waited another ordinary evening. Friends, dinner, laughter. Tomorrow morning, another notebook page would begin. Another observation, another improvement, another quiet step forward. Because that was how meaningful lives were truly built, not in extraordinary moments, but through ordinary days, lived with extraordinary consistency. And somewhere long after newspapers stopped printing his name and ceremonies became distant memories, thousands of bridges continued watching over millions of strangers, quietly, reliably, just as the engineer who created them had always hoped. Life has a remarkable way of reminding us that our greatest battles are often invisible to everyone else. People may judge us by our weakest moment, walk away when life becomes difficult, or believe that one tragedy is enough to define our future. But as Johnny's journey shows, true strength is not found in never falling. It is found in choosing to rise one step at a time, even when nobody is watching. Success built on integrity, patience, and perseverance lasts far longer than success built on pride or revenge. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is that forgiveness is not about excusing the people who hurt us. It is about refusing to let pain control the rest of our lives. The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is shaped by the decisions we make today. Every small act of discipline, every honest effort, and every choice to keep moving forward becomes another brick in the foundation of a better life. In the end, the greatest victory is not proving others wrong. It is becoming the person you were always capable of being. If this story touched your heart or inspired you to keep believing in yourself, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us which moment impacted you the most. Your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring journey.